Howdy, everybody, and welcome to another entry in the Super Robot Wars archives. My name is Austin. Today, we're going to be doing some high key / low key kind of content in the form of a tier list. It feels appropriate that I probably start trying to do something a little bit like this. I know people are big fans of them, and I do think it's helpful for conversation. They're not necessarily my favorite medium, but we'll talk about that in a second. But before we get started, I just want to say I appreciate all of y'all being here. Thank you so much for clicking on content. I continue to be surprised about people being interested in my videos. I'll say it every video if that's what it takes to get me to feel the fullness of the emotion that I'm experiencing over here. So just thank you again for being here. I want to keep making more stuff. I have this craving to create now that I know people care, and I hope this is going to be another proof of concept for something else we could be doing with the channel too. So again, as always, feedback is appreciated. So let's jump into some sort of author's notes, editor's notes. I am not fully scripting this, if you can't tell already. I know what I'm going to say in general, but I don't have notes I want to read off because I don't think that is, or I mean, it's obviously not organic, but it's also not kind of the vibe that I want to be giving off of this sort of conversation. It's important to me that how it's being communicated is as casual as what is being said. So apologies if there's some more umming and awing or pauses and stops than you might otherwise expect. I'm going to try and do this in as few takes as possible. It's going to be a long night, so thank you for your patience there. But yeah, I generally do not like tier lists because I think they don't come with enough context to make meaning out of the list that's being given. We as nerds love organizing things and love putting things into categories and hierarchies and all that. And that's admittedly all very arbitrary. And if we're all willing to acknowledge that, then fine, we can move on with the exercise. But I feel like I gotta make my piece here too. Just feel like I'm doing my due diligence in communicating this information, right? So I want to approach this tier list from a perspective of efficiency and efficacy while playing. That's not to say that you should approach the game that way, or that I think that's the best way to approach the game, the most fun way. Maybe that's not how you want to approach the game, and I think you are not wrong for that. I think you, in fact, are probably having a better time than I am when playing these games. But I do think it's still an interesting point of conversation. So I want to preface, too, that if I say anything negative about a unit or a character that you like, I don't think that they are it's a moral quandary on your part if you use them, if you like them. You will see characters that are way lower down than I would place them if I was ranking them based on just how much I like that character. Speaking of that, though, if you want a tier list that's more like that, one of those will be upcoming in a future video. I do think there's another thing we can do with this, and I'd like to try and experiment with that, but that's going to be a little bit down the line. So yeah, if you're hearing some of my words and you're like, wow, he's really trashing on this unit, that's so pessimistic. It's in the context of this game specifically, with the mindset of trying to approach, I want to clear the game as fast as possible, as effectively as possible, and with as not, I was gonna say as little effort, but some of these units require a lot of effort to use, but with as little hassle as possible, right? Is this going to require me to do 50 actions, or is it going to require me to do 10? You understand? So with that in mind, one of the biggest differences you're going to see here on this tier list is units that are very powerful or provide a lot of utility to gameplay might end up being ranked a little bit lower, because part of my understanding and expression of efficiency is also that they have contributed to a large portion of your gameplay. If I have a character that does a really good job, but I only have them for 2 scenarios, they're not going to get a lot of credit for doing that because they could have been contributing the entire playthrough and haven't been. Whereas a character that can do a decently good job, but has been doing so throughout the entire playthrough, is going to get a lot more credit because they are constantly contributing something meaningful. Does that make sense? I recognize that this is maybe not how everyone is going to approach things, but like I said, it's important to me that I at least express what bias I am approaching this tier list with as we are communicating it. And I think if you're just looking at this document as a single piece of text without my commentary, you are kind of missing part of that crucial understanding aligning step. There's a little bit more to this, but we're going to sort of suss that out as we get through the examples, because it's just going to be easier if we're talking about them more specifically rather than in the abstract. As we're still working on this preface, and this is probably where if I had scripted this, it would be a little bit more organized. I do think we probably should talk about like why I'm making the tiers that I am. These ones you'll see are pretty normal, but we're going to get down to some weirder stuff at the bottom. So we'll start talking about the basic tiers and try to justify what the break in a tier is. So to me, when I talk about something being S tier, that is above what is normal, above what a reasonable grade is. So to me, I think of S tier units as those that kind of feel like you are playing another game. We regularly talk about this sort of general arc upward towards a more inflated stat pool in across the series, and using characters in the S tier sort of feels like you're getting a preview for the next game that's been, you know, dialed up just one more notch on the dial. Typically, these characters are going to be able to handle basically anything you can throw at them, and probably then some. There's probably no scenario where they're not going to be able to perform some part of that task, if not that task fully, and they will continue to perform that task largely over the course of the entire scenario. Which is also why this tier is not very populated, because that's a lot to ask of a character. The difference with that between that and A tier is A tier can handle the task that you've given it really well, but it probably only has one or two tasks it can handle. Or if you're trying to ask it to handle something very general, right? If it can go all different directions in the scenario, it might not be able to fulfill all of them all at the same time, all throughout the whole scenario. It might need backup. So do you see the difference where we are being more specific as we're getting down about what job a character can do? You might also see, especially down here, there's one strange example I have that's sitting at the bottom of A tier, where a character that otherwise would perform in S comes much later in availability, that they can't have S. It would be inappropriate to put them in S tier because they would be contributing for so little part of the game, right? I do have a very specific example in the form of the Shin Getter, which we'll talk about more specifically when we get to him. B tier are units that are generally usable. You're not going to have a bad time using them, but they might have more specific niches, or they might require a collection of units from the B tier to be able to handle some of the problems. You can definitely invest into them to make their ability to handle whatever problem you are throwing them at much more solvable, or B tier units are those that have a lot of upfront value but are going to fall off later in the game. As opposed to C units, where it's C, it's average. They're the units that you sort of just fill in at the end when you have a deployment slot left. Or they are, again, units that should be in B tier, but show up so late into the game that it would be unreasonable to be able to place them anywhere higher because they are contributing for such a small percentage of the game. There are definitely some more oddities here in this C tier than you might see normally. But again, we'll get to those when we get to those. I would say D tier is where you are actively making your job harder if you're picking units from this category. Anything in the D tier is only going to perform if you are really well versed at the game, or you give a lot of resources, funds to invest into any of their upgrade parts. Their upgrade points, all of the best parts that are available to you, giving them all of the boss kills, giving them extra kills when you sort of wait a couple of extra turns to be able to give them some extra level ups. It's also the place where pilots who have maybe a decent pool of spirits are also just getting them at bafflingly irregular levels, right? There's a couple of characters in this game where, despite the fact that if you look at their spirit pool in abstraction, those spirits seem great. What's the problem here? But they only learned them at like level 30 or beyond, right? You're stuck with a very small spirit pool for most if not half if not most of the game. And that's never you can't possibly call that credit worthy. After D tier, we have three categories that are sort of getting lumped together, which is support, battleships, and I'm not doing that. Support is pretty obvious, but And battleships are pretty obvious, but I'm not doing that's going to require a little bit of explanation. But I do want to, A, draw these away from the rest of the groups and call attention to them as a whole collective, because these are sort of being assessed outside the confines of how the rest of this SABCD hierarchy is working. That's because the job that they perform is so specific and so counter to what the rest of S through D are doing that it is also, again, very misleading to include them somewhere in a tier that is largely based around combat, whereas their role is not going to be performing combat. I think it's a little bit messier for these games, but therefore also way easier, because most of these games are just about combat. There's not a lot of other objectives. Where that gets messy is what qualifies then as an actual support unit. It's very obvious to put characters that can provide spirits that two other pilots. It's also very easy to put units that have resupply and repair in this category, but do you have units that could perform combat that have pilots that do deploy spirits on other people that are kind of just used for their spirits, that you're not really using them for their combat, even though they might clean up a kill or two in the support tier? As of right now, I have not put them there, but I do think there is some argument to have located them in this tier. But again, just for full transparency about how I'm organizing it, those characters went in their respective hierarchies of A through D, or S through D. You had to, for me, either be able to resupply, repair, or both to fit into support. Then for the battleships, they work so wholly differently than the rest of the units, and because R has so many objectives, player-lost objectives that are centered around losing your battleships, again, it would be inappropriate to include them as if they were just part of a regular selection of units. You don't get to pick your battleship in the same way that you get to deploy your units. You can't opt to select the Rakhailum over the Nadeshko just because that would serve the scenario better. You are either forced to use both of them, or, depending on the scenario, one specific one. So again, I want to keep those relegated to their own confines. You should take support and battleships as part of a whole. Don't think of them solely and isolatedly out of the context of the rest of the units. The Nadeshko is a perfect example of that with one of its abilities, which we'll talk about when we actually discuss the units specifically. But they need to be discussed collectively in respect to each other, because that is the context by which you're going to be choosing them. I hope that makes sense. Then we have, I'm not doing that. These three units presented me a just monumental problem trying to get this tier list completed. The units are the Airmaster Burst, the Double X, and the Leopard Destroy, all combined with the G Falcon. And the reason there's a problem is you have taken two units, both of which have the ability to select one of 9 pilots, and put them together, where the pilot who is in the Gundam gets to have the stats of the Gundam. We have 9 plus 8 plus 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1 combinations of pilots in each unit, which is, I believe, 45. And then you double that to 90, because it actually does matter what order they are sitting in. If you have Witz and Royby in the Airmaster Burst and the G Falcon, which of those two pilots is in the driver's seat of the Airmaster Burst changes the stats that are available to that unit. So we have to count every set twice, and then there's 3 of them, so that's going to be 9 times 3, 270. That's 270 entries onto this tier list just because of these 3 units. I'm not doing that. As much as I say I want to be nuanced on this channel, as much as I said I want to talk about the specificity and the efficiency of R in this tier list, that level of detail, especially when there is not a lot of difference between them, between the pilots that can go into them, is just not really worth the amount of time that it would take up in the scope of this video. That would be more relevant in a conversation about that unit in particular. If I had a video that was just the Gundam Leopard and all of its different forms, or the Gundam Leopard Destroy and all of its forms or pilot options, then it might make more sense to talk about its pilot options. But here, it's probably not going to change its tier very much. But again, putting it in its tier feels like I'm not calling out the fact that I'm skipping over 270 potential entries. So we'll talk about those later, and I will mention where I think they should roughly go, but I feel the need to make them separate so that we can have that conversation. If I did my editing correctly, I should have some elements on the left and right sides of the screen right now. I am just looking at the tier list on Tier List Maker, but I think I'm going to be doctoring this up a little bit in post-production. And on those sides, I'm going to order the Universal Century pilots and the After War Gundam X pilots. There are a couple of other units that can switch. You'll see that in the Mazinger team, all of their examples are shown in across all of the units. And the early instances of the Gundam X pilots are included here. They're included here in the tier list because either A, there is actually a difference between where they would get placed, or B, there is not actually that many more units that are being fit onto this tier list by having all of them available to see. So I just kept them, which is betraying the point, which I probably should put at the beginning of what I'm talking about, which is to say all of the After War Gundam X and all of the Universal Century units keep their pilots in basically the same order, irrespective to which unit is being piloted. We'll talk about why when we get to those units, but just in case you're wondering why we have some garland of people sitting around the sides of this video, that's the reason. It's not going to come up. It'll come up a little bit when we get to A, but you will see why when we get down to C and D tier in more specificity. That said, it is quite possible that those are going to have to be a separate video. I've already been talking for nearly 20 minutes and we haven't talked about a unit yet. So this probably is going to get cut into 2 videos. It's actually probably going to end up being 3 videos because the keen-eyed among you will notice that none of the units that you get kind of during the future past tutorial beginning portion, you know what I mean if you've played the game, the first 4 scenarios, those are also going to be their own list, which we're going to cover once we go through the main game. They shouldn't be included with the rest of the tier list, and if you see units that look like the ones you get there, namely like the new Gundam or the Rigazi or the Super Istavalises, or the Istavalises Customs, I'm not taking into account how they function during the future scenarios when assessing this tier list, because those contributions are a lot more abstracted from when you actually get access to those units. So it's really hard to try to weigh something that gives a lot of contribution at the very beginning of the game and the very end of the game, as opposed to something that's giving contribution throughout the middle of the game, you know? So for the purposes of this tier list, then, we're going to be assuming that scenario 5, the first time you're going to start getting units that you can keep for the entire playthrough, is the very beginning of the game. If you're interested in the future scenarios, that tier list should be available, I would say, I think 2 weeks after the making of this, because this is going to get split into, another second video, and then after that, we'll have the future scenarios available. Something like that. You'll see it. But with that, let's jump in. S tier is going to be nice and short. It's going to be really easy and simple why all of these characters are here. They roughly have the same reasons, and we can just talk about why they've been broken down by this order. So, in my impression, not just in ARC, but in Super Robot Wars, spirits are perhaps the most busted thing that you have in your arsenal. Maybe after playing some more of the modern games, assist, or whatever the game's equivalent to assist from Y is, could potentially take the cake for that, but at least as far as R goes, having spirits is perhaps the most powerful thing you can do. So, when you have a unit that has more spirits because it has more pilots, you're just going to do more stuff. There are only 2 units that have 5 pilots in this game, and you'll notice they are at the very top of S. I could be convinced to switch the Voltace or the Combattler any day of the week. Like, these immediate positions and their adjacency are not necessarily the most firm fixed. If you have the ability to go, well, actually, the Neo Getter should probably be between the Combattler and the Voltace, I'm not sure if this tier list is for you. This channel very much is, and I would love to speak with you. But the purpose of this tier list is not necessarily to be that level of granular. Again, that's the sort of thing that might be more relevant for a video on one unit in particular. I'm comfortable with, rough positioning, If something that's at the end of a list for anything other than S, because S is so small, so like take the Shin Getter and the Daitarn, if those two should be switched, that is definitely a thing that's like worth talking about and I should address in the tier list. But if it's just one adjacent position, that's probably beyond the scope of this. You know what you're doing. I trust you can handle playing this game without my input. But so to return to our big beefy boys, they are so powerful immediately when you get them. They do not need investment, and they are still probably going to do better than the vast majority of the cast. But if you also give them investment, they're going to use that money better than most of the rest of the cast. Right? One of the problems we have talking about characters, I think, in a lot of tactics games is we say we have resources, but allocating resources to any one of those units gives them, quote, favoritism. But, like, you have them to use. Someone needs to use them. So we got to try and ask who uses them the best. And I would say, as far as the money goes, the Combattler and the Voltace use the money probably among the best of the rest of your team. Their parts contributions are a little interesting and awkward. They definitely want the defensive parts kind of more than anything else because they can very rapidly reach a point where they take negligible amounts of damage. You can't take no damage in this game, kind of. If you're taking damage, the minimum you're taking is 10. Again, barring one restriction. But in the face of what is potentially 5 digits of HP, that is practically nothing. Especially if I'm thinking about, you know, most scenarios can be cleared in 5 or fewer turns. I cleared most of them in 7 on my playthrough on the channel, and I described myself as intentionally not going very fast. I think you can probably clear them way more rapidly if you want to push. So that is effectively 0 amount of damage, and they can reach that point very early on into their career. A lot of units can probably reach 0 damage, but it's gonna take them a long while to get access to that. In addition to that, though, they pretty well always have a relevant verb. They don't have the most long-range post-movement attacks, and they also don't have the greatest amount of movement on their own to begin with. But because you have so many spirits, because you have so many pilots, you pretty well also just get to always turn on Excel, so their movement is just 3 higher than you would think normally. They have 5 movement to start, but so they're going to have 8 movement, which I would say is a point of a spot where movement is like that's a good amount of movement to have, right? I'm saying 5 is low for this game. Nothing has lower than 5 by default. 6 is average. Most pilots have 6. 7 is decent. 8 is decent, and there's, I believe, an example of one character that has above 9 by default. And so anything up in that amount is really rather good, which is to say that also mitigates their inability to have long-range post-movement attacks. The Voltace and the Combattler also get a combination attack, so if they're going to be fighting bosses, and they are very good at clearing bosses for you, the fact that one of them has an attack that it actively wants to use, it's one of its most damaging attacks, that's the Voltace, that it can be performed at a 2 range, so you can have the Combattler on an orthogonal and the Voltace at a diagonal, so that they can support attack each other if you don't have range for their combination attack. Or you can have them adjacent, so the Combattler could use the combination attack of both of them, then the Voltace could follow up on the Voltace's own turn with its best action too. I apologize that I won't be referring to the names of the attacks. I can't remember them off the top of my head because they're still in Japanese, and like odds are you're probably gonna be playing in Japanese too, so saying the names aren't necessarily going to be the most helpful, but like if I say the best attack, I think you'll be able to follow. They are a bit dire when it comes to energy. You probably could justify dedicating one of their part slots to energy, but you should probably also have an energy restorer on your team, and if you get them into the late game, and like I said, there's no reason you shouldn't be, they also have the ability to restore their own energy with some spirit usage, so they're like, they just maintain their ability to be consistent throughout the whole game. There is always a relevant spirit that they can cast. They could zeal themselves or advance someone else. That is to say, give them extra turns, and there's nothing better to going fast than having extra turns. And a lot of the spirits they're casting are staying, right? You're going to need to recast something like Excel, but they're going to get to keep their bullseye, stuff like that. And then the Neo Getter and the Zambot do rough approximations of all of those things. You can point them at generics and they'll be able to take them down. You can point them at bosses, they'll be able to take them down. They have spirits they want to cast on themselves for survivability. They have spirits they want to cast on the rest of your team to support them if they need. They can give themselves more turns. Practically, they can do everything. The Neo Getter I have third because while it has every one of those properties, it doesn't have all of those properties all at the same time. There's definitely some circumstances where you want one element of one and another element of another. So like you might want A in the water, but then you also might want to be able to move a lot afterwards. You can switch, and that doesn't require any investment, any turns to do that. But if you need to move really far, I guess I put it in the wrong order before. If you want to move really far, but then be in the water, that would theoretically need you to turn from Getter 2 into Getter 3 in the middle of an action, and you're not able to do that. So if you're trying to think about both your player phase and the enemy phase, that's when the Neo Getter is going to maybe have a couple of rough patches, and I mean very minor, just compared to something like the Competitor or the Voltace. Which is not to say that they can do everything that the Getter can do. Like, there's definitely some unique qualities, right? Like, the Getter can turn into the Getter 3 and thus go in the water. It can't hold extra parts in the way it can in other games, so don't give it credit that way, right? All the part slots are shared among all three, just as all the upgrades are shared among all three, which is, I would say, definitely a perk of it. And it can get more movement than the Compatiler and the Voltace, and it can get access to, if I remember correctly, it can give itself extra turns with Zeal sooner rather than later, as opposed to the Compatiler and the Voltace. Like, it gets roughly the same relevant spirits, but it tends to get them, the pilots Go, Show, and Die tend to receive their spirits at an earlier level. And it's also getting a lot of credit from the fact that it's not its last form. So if you invest into the Neo Getter early, you will also see it pay dividends out in the Shin Getter. I have separated out these forms, and I've done this for basically all of the units. I don't think there are any exceptions if I remember correctly. I did edit this tier list in the last minute to try and condense some entries to make it a little bit more readable. This used to have like 350 entries on it. Now it only has like 170. 170 is still a lot, but we'll blitz through it when we get to some of the more grouped ones. The Shin Getter is separate because it does things differently than the Neo Getter, and you might see the Shin Getter perform because it's force deployed in its stage, and then go, oh, that's something I want to use now that it works X way. Whereas the Neo Getter you're going to have immediately, so you can invest into it earlier, whereas you have to wait for the Shin Getter. Does that make sense? I think I've explained that in a way that is like kind of cogent, I hope. And then the same with the Zambot, right? It has a lot of very good, it has a lot of very high value damage post movement, but 1 range options. One of its best attacks has 7 range, but you don't get I believe it's called the Ion Cannon. You also don't get that until late game, and you also have to pick a specific route split to get access to it. So like it's gonna get knocked down from having to wait until later in the game to get upgrades, and in only specific scenarios can you get access to them. I'm not sure I have a clear answer on which is better for each route split other than the tutorial future one. But it is still definitely a stipulation. It is a requirement that needs to be fulfilled to get access to the best version of the kit. Whereas the Compatiler and the Voltace have no such stipulations. You would happily use the unit that you got on Scenario 13 or Scenario 14 in Scenario 37 with no upgrades. That wraps up S tier. I'm hoping that the next couple of these are going to go a little bit more quickly because we already have sort of established like what is our baseline for quality, and we can sort of keep pointing back to those. So I say this in particular because I also had a rough time deciding whether Daitarn should be at the bottom of S or the top of A. And I think ultimately I decided on the top of A simply because Banjo is but 1 man. He does have SP as if he is supposed to be 3 pilots. He has if not the highest SP in the game, one of the highest SPs in the game, to try to account for the fact that he's a super robot pilot and doesn't have a team of people along with him. But while he can cast his 6 spirits as if he had the breadth of spirit casting as a 3-man team, he still at the end of the day also only has 6 spirits. They are good ones. He has Bullseye, which admittedly I'm not giving a lot of people credit for because a lot of people can do it. It's a little bit more of a spirit that if you don't have, you're going to get docked for it. He has the Spirit, which he's not probably going to use all of the time, but it's definitely a thing he has available to him. But he also, most importantly, has Valor, Willpower, and Persist, and decently early. None of those spirits are like tremendously stand out on their own, but at a bare minimum, a defensive unit that is supposed to punch high value targets should have those spirits at default. So he is doing all of the things that he is supposed to be doing, but he is only doing all of the things that he is supposed to be doing. He's not doing anything else that stand out. I mean, it's one of the best combinations of defenses Banjo and the Daitarn have among the highest defenses, but among the highest defenses is not the highest, you know? And again, a lot of these are post-movement options. So, or they are one range post-movement options. So he can't get that much credit for it. He does have some non-one ranged options, like a lot more than some of the other supers, but they are so much weaker, and they are also using his worst stat ranged as opposed to melee, whereas like the next example, and this is how we're going to segue into the Great Mazinger, despite the fact that the Great Mazinger has long-ranged options, all of them get to be melee to try and support Tetsuya and Koji in their best stat. So I guess let's first talk about why I have these 5 separated. I'm probably going to talk about this a little bit more as we talk once we get into the support units. I didn't know how I wanted to break this up, because on one hand we could talk about the support units first, as they are going to set a lot of the actual ground rules for how I think about whether a unit is good or whether it's going to be on my team or not. But it does also feel like I'm putting a penny for my thoughts before my gift horse, of which I've looked at its mouth, which is to say, I am mixing what I am trying to do, and I'm doing it in the wrong order, no matter which way I do it. So we're going to go with the more proactive actions first in the form of the combat units, and then talk about the supports second. But I could see where someone might go, could we do the supports first next time? And that would be an amenable suggestion. But I also want to separate all 5 of them out because they do have a slightly more unique way of interacting with their units, both individually but as a collective. One of the things I recommend the most if you want to try and play this game at its optimal level is using the Mazinger pilots and using all of the Mazinger pilots that you can get your hands on, at minimum 3, but ideally all 5 of them, and constantly rotate them between their mechs. Whoever has the 2 highest levels should be in the 2 damage-based units, the Great Mazinger and the Mazinger Z, in that order. Then whoever has the lowest level should be in the Boss Borat, and whoever has the next 2 lowest levels should be in the Venus and the Aphrodite, the Venus being the priority. That's because resupplying pays the highest dividends on EXP, especially between the differences of low level to high level, and then repairing pays the next highest dividends versus just actually going to combat. So you have a way of training the characters that are at a lower level without needing to risk anything or detract from their ability to contribute to a scenario. Unfortunately, not all 5 of these pilots have a lot to offer when they're in a support role. Tetsuya and Koji are definitely going to be outliers here, and we'll talk about them when we get to supports, but it also matters here because they have a priority for getting to use the melee-based units because they perform the best in them and barely perform beyond just what those 2 verbs do normally, resupplying and repairing respectively, as opposed to the more support-oriented characters, Jun, Boss, and Sayaka, who can perform middlingly in all of the roles. So let's talk specifics. Tetsuya is far and away the best combat pilot for the Mazinger team. He has the highest damage out of all of them. He has the best defense out of all of them, and is doing roughly the same thing that Koji is doing in terms of spirits. He has extra damage, he has bullseyes, and I prioritize bullseyes a lot on the Great Mazinger specifically because of the one unique quirk that it has. It's one of, if not the only unit I can think of, there's a lot of them to remember, so apologies if I forgot one, that has a single-use weapon. It has the Great Booster. It's also its most damaging barring combination attacks. So because your odds are going to be far away, you're using it at its best if you're hitting a far away target, because that's not a thing it can normally do. And being able to have that sort of one-off utility is definitely a step up in terms of quality. Because you're farther away, you're going to be losing some accuracy. So that's especially where I value having Bullseye. Pretty much all these pilots get it. I think Sayaka doesn't, but Tetsuya also gets his, of the ones that are good at combat, early. I will say, in my mind, Jun is also qualifying as someone who is good at combat. Her stats are a little bit less than Tetsuya's, but as I've said before in some of these videos, a change in melee, a change in combat stats, 1 point in combat stats is half a percentage points different in terms of damage. So if you're changing by, I think the difference is about 10 points, that is a 5% swing in terms of damage. That is not nothing. It is a little bit more considerable on the Mazingers because they have Majin power, but because they also have Majin power, they're also making up for that difference. You're probably not going to notice that 5% difference very much. And unlike other times where we're going to be slotting units in other times where we're going to be slotting pilots in amongst units where we're going to have to compare pilot to pilot, because of this overarching game plan, every pilot is not going to be at a symmetric level. So it's very possible that you're going to be comparing a Jun that's 5 levels higher than Tetsuya. So the actual difference between their stats is going to be a lot more negligible, as opposed to what would normally happen if each of these pilots had a unique unit. Does that make sense? So yeah, Tetsuya and Koji are basically the same pilot in all ways, except Tetsuya is just kind of better at everything. He has more melee. He has more ranged, but neither of them use range, so that doesn't matter. He has more defense. Skill also kind of doesn't matter. I still don't know how crit timing or crit calculations work or how skill activations work. Even still, at their most disparate, so like if you're at 99 and the enemy is at like 12, you're still not even seeing them activate that consistently. So I can't incorporate it into like any system of logic, and even if I could, it's not going to have that much value. And evasion's pretty much non-existent for these two. They're going to be defending anyway, and technically Koji has 1 more point of accuracy. Well, Koji does have 1 point of accuracy, so technically he is better, but that 1 point is so negligible that it's not enough to change my mind about where his position is. Tetsuya also, very importantly, if you want to go fast, has Accelerate, and if we want to take fewer turns, that's definitely going to work. That I don't know what to tell you. It's there. You'll see some consistent patterns. Actually, to that point, I will link a spreadsheet that I made down in the description. I did not follow it completely because by the end of making it, I realized that there was definitely something flawed in how I made it. I kind of used it as like a rough estimate. If I was like, all right, I've got 2 characters that I know are close to each other, where should they go? And then I used that to sort of break those ties. But I tried to enumerate all of the logic behind why I thought characters were effective, giving a point total to all of the elements that I value. I'm not going to talk about it much more in specifics here, because again, that could be its own video. I'm happy to discuss it more in the comments why I've pointed things out the way that I did. But you can go and check it out down there. But as I was saying, I was thinking about the sort of like patterns of what you're going to see that I value. Looking at it in terms of that spreadsheet is also a very quick way to gather like, oh, here's the things that he's going to rate highly. Which, speaking of, Jun not only gets a lot of spirits we value, most notably Rouse and Dedication, she also gets them earlier on than a lot of other pilots do. Not the earliest, but earlier on. I typically consider Boss the worst of the Mazinger pilots, but I wanted to push him forward 1 step here, maybe as a meme. This is maybe me breaking the conceit of this tier list, but because he can self-destruct. which if you have watched my other content, has featured somewhat prominently in Super Robot Wars, or sorry, ruining Super Robot Wars R. And by prominently, I mean for one episode, but also, or one chapter, but it took a large portion of the video time, so, you know. But self-destruct does damage equal to the HP of the unit, or the HP remaining of the unit. And the Great Mazinger, of the 5 Mazinger pilots, of the 5 Mazinger units, has the highest HP, and it is also, of all of the units in the game, one of the highest HP. It's definitely a thing you can do. It's not necessarily a great thing you can do, but Boss is not here exclusively on that, right? It's a little step up. It is definitely an action, and it's definitely not a bad one. And then Sayaka is the only one who's left, so I guess she has to be at the bottom. She is still decent. Like, she still learns spirits that you want to be casting on people. She learns Rouse and Resupply. Both Jun and Sayaka learn Rouse at the same time. But I would prefer Dedication over Resupply, but I would still like to have a Resupply. Sayaka also learns Bless, which I would say is... she has that over Jun. I had a hard time rating this too, so as much as I'm trying to incorporate the best, most optimized strategies in the heaviest of air quotes possible, there is some amount of like psychology and some amount of like game direction involved in this too, and Sayaka is in the Diana to start. And it doesn't fly, which means you're going to be able to get to other pilots less often. So while having Sayaka early means she has a higher opportunity, she has a larger opportunity to level up, her unit sort of holds her back because it's more regular that you're not actually going to be able to reach the characters that need to get healing to be like farming EXP every level. Whereas the Venus that Jun comes in does fly, so you're going to pretty well always be able to be participant. I know that's again sort of talking about supports already, but because these characters are always going to have to be in the context of switching units, it's hard not to be thinking about them, you know? So I think that's the Great Mazinger. It'll probably come back up too as we talk about the rest of the Mazingers. But let's hop over to the Gundam X pilots for a second. So I have the Airmaster here with just Wits, Jared, and Royby, and that is because unlike the most of the rest of the Gundam X units, the rest of the team is never going to see the ability to pilot this, because by the time you get access to the rest of the Gundam X pilots, the Airmaster will switch to the Airmaster Burst, which is why if you see down here, the Airmaster Burst doesn't have any pilots next to them. That's because that's going to use the track on the side of your screen that has all of the Gundam X pilots in order. So fortunately, the Airmaster already has its correct pilot in it, which is to say Wits. He is the most evasive. None of their stats are all that different from each other, but if we're trying to talk about the most small and specific of specifics, Wits does have the second best evasion, just ever so slightly edging out Jared. Edged out by Jared. And then he has the highest range damage, just ever so slightly edging out Jared. The only spirit that Jared comes with that I care about at first is Focus. I just don't value Jared as a pilot. I think he's a pretty bad one. It takes so long to get spirits on him that matter. He does eventually get a fortune, but it's a long time between when you get him at first. He gets at level 17, which does not sound like that long of a time comparatively, but because he is almost unfunctional when you get him at first, getting him to fortune is going to be rough. And fortune isn't really securing him kills anymore. It's not making his kills any easier, it's just making his kills more valuable. But you kind of already need to be good at getting the job done before you can get like double rewards, you know? And then Royby is just the worst of the three at doing what the Airmaster wants to do. All of them do have focus, which is definitely making it easier, but he has the lowest of the stats, and he probably has a better job elsewhere, which we'll talk about when we get down to a lower tier. Wits also has like practically no melee stat, and both of the other two units have a viable melee option, so it's like also maybe slightly more prudent to put them there. But most notably, if you aren't sick of it already, we'll add this to the list. Wits also has Excel, and I'm always going to value that, especially out of a unit who I would say could surprisingly well get the job done through most of the game. Again, because this is a unit that you can invest in on what is effectively equivalent to Scenario 1. You get it at Scenario 5, but again, it's right after the future skip. If you invest into it at the beginning of the game, you will continue to see it pay off in the form of the Airmaster Burst later, which is just a strict upgrade. And it's one of the first units that is probably able to reach that 0% hit by enemies threshold, especially if you're using the focus on any of the pilots. Like, any of the pilots can do that part, but like as far as investing into the unit itself, not thinking about the pilot in specifics anymore, you're probably going to be able to send it in and make it avoid pretty much every hit. Admittedly, it's probably going to be fighting generics more than bosses. It's not to say it can't chip bosses, but it's going to be chipping bosses, probably not one-shotting them, or at the very least, like, greatly contributing to that combat. But, on the other hand, on the third other wing on top of it, I guess, you can throw it at one side of an enemy formation, and they will get distracted by trying to shoot it because nothing else is going to be in range, and it's not going to take a hit because it has such a high evade. So it can really handle one side of the map sort of on its own. It does have ammo-based weapons, and it does not have a lot of room for parts. It has a lot of parts that it wants to be using, right? It wants to be using mobility as much as it can, but then you probably also want to dedicate a part slot somehow to addressing its ammo consumption needs. It does have 40 attacks, 20 from both of its weapons. Its first attack is considerably worse, so you kind of don't want to rely on that, but it's there if it would get the kill, right? It's a difference of it's halved in power. It's 2,000 power for its better one, 1,000 for its worst one, right? So hit enemies on turn, attack an enemy on turn 1, get counterattacked by the Airmaster on turn 2, and it's probably, if not dead, close to dead, where you can then take it out on turn 3, while you're then countering all of the other enemies, bringing them down to that threshold, then finishing them off on player phase turn 3, and then enemy phase turn 3. But it's going to need ammo at some point. I will say, one of the other reasons I don't necessarily love tier lists is I don't like this idea that I'm coming down with information on high to disseminate to you. I think that is an unhealthy way of approaching information and my job as a content creator. So I also want to talk about my process so you can try to make an informed decision on your own. I don't think I'm necessarily doing it the right way. I think the way I'm doing it is good, otherwise I wouldn't do it that way, but you don't have to do it this way. But the reason I'm also thinking of Wits as a unit that is designed around killing generics over bosses, and I'm applying this to every unit I'm looking at, is just think how many times you get to take actions with them. Something like the Mazinger, the Great Mazinger, they're going to run out of energy very quickly. If you have only one shot of a piece of an ammo, you don't want to be spending that on just a regular generic. You want to be spending that on a boss, or at least a sub-boss, right? One of the more tankies. If you want to send it after a professional machine jam, the thing that the game pretends is a boss for a while, or at least the second in command for the scenario, right? That's a good use of is it called the booster dasher, the great booster, the rocket that the Great Mazinger shoots off of its back. It's 3,700 power attack. Right, that's a defensible use of it. But when you see something that has it's 40 attacks between two different weapons, that's a lot of times you're going to get to use that action. So where are you going to see combat a lot rather than a lot of combat for a short amount of time? Well, that's going to be fighting generics. Which is not to say that that's not a thing that you want a unit to do. Anyone can fight anything, but it is the efficiency with which the Airmaster can handle them, right? Like I said, you can throw it at a corner of a map, and it can probably distract 5-10 enemies, even if you're not necessarily trying to fully plan around it. That's the mark of a good unit. And then because Wits has Excel, you can then move from that position once it is either fully handled or controlled enough that another unit, another one of the B or C tier flunkies, can come in and clean it up. He can then move over to wherever he needs to be next, in a way that Jared and Roy B are going to have a slightly harder time of doing that when they don't have that extra 3 movement. I think that largely covers it here. I'm not even sure much more to say for the Airmaster Burst. It's just that, but better. But we'll jump to the Mazinger and then we'll go back to that. The Mazinger Z does have to be slightly below the Great Mazinger, despite the fact that you get it first. It just all around has pretty well worse stats. It doesn't do that much different than the Great Mazinger, but it does do, I would say, something slightly different. At least with the Great Mazinger, you can both be fighting a boss and then also maybe still leaving a couple of enemies for you to be picking off with the Great Mazinger. Whereas the Mazinger Z probably wants pretty much everything finished off, if not just focusing on the boss. The Mazinger Z has slightly more costly attacks, and it needs also to be at closer range to do them. At least with the Great Mazinger, you have a couple of long-ranged options, whereas with Mazinger Z, all of the options you want to be taking are basically right in front of you. Let me pull up my notes just to make sure I'm not saying that without I make a fool of myself. Oh yeah, it does have the Kyo Kagata rocket punch, which is basically the same thing as the booster from the Great Mazinger, the Great Booster, but you also don't have that for the entire game, if I remember correctly. That is something that you're going to get later. Whereas the Great Mazinger comes with his to start, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly. So other than that, everything else is pretty well, like, always going to be in close range, unless you're factoring for combination attacks. And, like, I tend not to value them very highly just because they are very costly between both of the units. And I would much rather 2 attacks at, like, medium to medium high damage than a really costly attack at very high damage, because odds are you're still not going to be killing something with an attack that has like 500 or 600 more power, but you've used up what could have been 3 turns to kill it slightly more dead in 2 rounds, you know? But the Mazinger Z is just, like, all around numbers wise a worse version of the Great Mazinger, and you get both of them in enough time that I would still consider that the early game. I guess I should have opened with this too. I divided the game into 4 segments, so I divided the game into 4 even segments such that I could try to mark when you were getting a unit and then give it some value based on, like, how early that was. So scenarios 5 to 12 were the early game, 13 to 20 were the early to middle game, 21 to 28 were the middle to late game, and 29 to 36 were the late game. You'll notice I'm missing 27. It was just that everything divided really cleanly without 27 being on there, and then 27 is just the late game, because you don't get anything for the last scenario. And people already like making the last scenario its sort of like own plan for thing, so I didn't mind sort of setting it aside like that. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to play for the last scenario, but it is, like, I will at least acknowledge that that is a way people play into, and I at least should, like, try to think about how I'm presenting information as if people are going to be consuming it in that way, right? So you get the Great Mazinger on turn. You get the Great Mazinger in scenario 12. So it's still within the early game, which still gives it plenty enough time to contribute. So in this case, the superior stats are going to win out over a couple of extra turns. And again, it's not as hard to level up these characters as it is maybe somebody else, where, like, you know, I'm going to penalize a unit and a pilot for a 3 scenario difference, and I'm not penalizing a pilot for a 7 scenario difference here. But that's also because of the ability for pilots to catch up on levels so rapidly through all of the support actions that that this team has, right? All of these are constantly part of an ecosystem of units rather than on their own. I think, again, if they're used at their best. But the Mazinger by itself is still very good. Like Majin Power, which increases damage by 25%. It's your final damage, not your pre-calculation damage. So it's the worst version of increasing this. Like, you want that percentage earlier on in the equation, but like 25% extra damage is still a lot more than most changes, right? Like a rivalry bonus could only be 5%. Like that's 25 is a lot, and you already have decently high attack value, so it's going to contribute even further. Everything I said about the pilots for the Great Mazinger are true, except I just have boss 1 tier lower, or not 1 tier, 1 slot lower, because blowing up in the Mazinger is just not as productive as the Great Mazinger. So let me start first by saying, in case this audio sounds a little bit weird, I am recording this after the fact. I definitely forgot to talk about the Airmaster Burst and also all of the Gundam X pilots. So let's do that now. First, let's talk about the unit. There are two key differences between the Airmaster and the Airmaster Burst, and that's also why it's getting put in A tier. I've already said I super value extra movement, and the Airmaster Burst has one more movement in both forms, both its mobile suit mode and its mobile armor mode. But most importantly, it's 10 in mobile armor mode, which is going to factor into the second portion of this, which is to say the mobility. So I guess actually first, when you are switching back and forth between a mobile suit and a mobile armor mode, regardless of whether it uses that nomenclature from Gundam or not, you're going to have, generally speaking, slightly different stats. One is going to be slightly more mobility focused, and one is going to be slightly more armor focused. It's not a big difference, but it is a difference. It's usually somewhere between 5 to 15 points, and unsurprisingly, the average being 10, it usually is landing on that 10. Now, at least to me, I would expect the one that is shaped like a jet to be the one that is more mobile, and the one that is shaped like a guy to be less mobile. But the Airmaster is not that way. The Airmaster is more mobile in its mobile suit form. The Airmaster Burst, however, fixes this and makes it such that the jet is more mobile. And it also bumps up both values of the stats, right? So we go from having, hold on, let me get my notes out, 800 mobility for the Airmaster Burst flight mode to, oh, hold on, not 800, sorry, 95 mobility to 115 mobility. So that's a 20-point jump, which is that's considerable. We are now more mobility focused in the form that we want to be moving around in more, which inherently is going to be the one where we want to be taking attacks more. So it is definitely like multiple improvements. It's not just that it's a stat up, it's a stat up in the right place. Make sense? But that's like really the only big difference. Everything else is just like incrementally grown compared to where the original unit was, or it's like gaining things that just don't actually affect its use case. I do have to have it a little bit lower though, because you're getting it in scenario 20. That is the very last scenario of the, what did I call that? The early mid game? Yeah, the early mid game. It is the last scenario of that. So it's not like really deep into the game, but it's like, it's kind of far into the game. But it's like, it's still getting an A tier, right? This is still the like among the worst of the best lot. Now let's talk pilots, and I think this is maybe the like weirder section of how these pilots get organized, just because we already have a like desirable use case for early game, which is to say Wits, Jared, then Royby. But if you look down the side, you'll see that it's Royby, Wits, Jared, and Jared a second time. We'll talk about that. But I want to like call this group out together first, because you're going to be having them for the majority of the game. I guess actually, hold on, sorry, technically Jamil should be part of this conversation too, because you are going to have him for the majority of the game, just in a different capacity. But in my impression, Royby is a more relevant pilot for long term. So his position at the top of this list applies to every Gundam X unit, other than the 3 that you can only keep for the first portion of the game where you don't have the other pilots in context. But when put in context of all of the other pilots and also all of the other units, it is my impression that Royby is the best. He starts with a focus, so he gets to fix all the accuracy problems. He also starts with Daunt, and if you've seen any of my playthroughs, I do value Daunt really highly. It's actually effective in R, as opposed to my refusal to acknowledge that it's ineffective in some other games. But that contributes usually a good deal more than what the other pilots are bringing to the table. Many of the Gundam X units are statted at least decently enough that you aren't going to need a lot of spirits to help make up for them. You're going to want like things like Valor to double damage, of course. But you might be surprised to see that Wits is now ranking below Royby, despite the fact that I was like, oh yes, he's got Excel, that's really great. The reason is, and the reason why I wanted to clarify this applies to all units, and I'm trying to think of them all at the same time, even if we're talking about it in the context of the Airmaster Burst right now, is that the vast majority of the Gundam X units don't actually care about having Excel. So if you're trying to play them to the best version of what they want to do, they don't need to be getting extra movement. I value extra movement, which is why you'll see most of them are lower down on the tier list, because the play pattern that they want to produce does not involve going fast. But trying to force them to do something that they aren't designed to do, I don't think gives them a higher rating in my book. I rate something higher if it is performing its job really well. You just might not need to call on a unit that does that kind of job regularly. So, like, Roy B not having Excel does not detract that much from the rest of these units that almost all of their best attacks are not post-movement. And a best attack, I guess I sort of throw this term around a little bit loosely in this tier list, so let me try and, like, clarify that now. A best attack is not necessarily the most damaging attack. It's the attack that the unit wants to be using the most. So sometimes it's the most damaging attack. Sometimes it's the longest ranged attack. Sometimes it's the attack that has a post movement that's like a decent amount of range. And, well, a lot of the Gundam X units have attacks that want to be used, that are long range, that are not post movement. You don't really need an Excel to help that at all. Otherwise, these two still remain the most proficient pilots, partly because you've had longer to train them than the rest of the team, so they're probably going to be a higher level, or they're going to have some kills invested into them. I know that pilots scale by level, but, like, you're not going to train your whole team, so people like Karis and Anil and Lancer and Pala are going to have their levels brought down by all the characters you are not training. If you are looking at some of the Gundam X units and you're like, oh, I kind of want to use these now, Roy B and Wits are still decent characters to train. I would say that one of the reasons why I have Jared plus Tifa as position 3 is if you want to pick up a Gundam X pilot later on into the game, it should probably be him / those two. But I do still need to represent the fact that I think they're worth training early into the game so that the rest, like the early team, is going to have some levels and therefore credit over the rest. But yeah, so Jared and Tifa, and then Jared right behind them. You can get access to Tifa late into the game, but she is also so good and is exactly what Jared needs. She still ends up getting a lot of credit, and combined, they have a really massive SP pool. I don't remember off the top of my head. It's what at base? Yeah, it's base 105, which is, I guess, it's like rivaling the Daitarn, so that's like pretty sizable. I gave the Daitarn credit for having that amount of SP. It's just really stand out amongst Gundam pilots, because Gundam pilots, I guess real robot pilots, tend to have really low SP. But not just that, Tifa also just has really good spirits. She has zeal and rouse. She also just has, like, she has zeal and rouse, which are spirits I give pilots like active credit for. But she also has more passive things that are relevant, like cheer and flash. But I think the largest contribution she has, and I think this is the only instance of a support pilot offering a skill to the main pilot, is that Tifa has new type X. So we'll use this entry also as a conversation to talk about all 4 of those skills. But Jared deeply needs that help with accuracy. So and dodging, right? Because like these units are not very survivable. She starts with at least 3 levels of it, quote. But you're not going to be picking up Tifa at level 1. You're not going to be picking up Tifa at level 13. Like, odds are she's going to be probably in the 30s, maybe a little bit below if you're going like really efficiently. So you could very feasibly start her with 5 levels of new type X, and that's a really big jump to accuracy and evade at all times. So yeah, let's talk about those 4 skills real quick. I will try not to spend a lot of time on this, I hope, because they all do roughly the same things. It should be easy to explain. There's new type and enhanced human. Those go on to Universal Century pilots, and then there's new type X and artificial new type, and those go on to Afterwar Gundam X pilots. Everyone from the Universal Century has one of their 2 effects. Only 4 people, I'm pretty sure it's 4. It's Tifa, Jamil, Karis, and Lancero. Yeah, 4 have new type X or artificial new type. The Gundam X set bookend the Universal Century set, so its new type X is better than new type, is better than enhanced human, is better than artificial new type. All of them do the same thing, in quotes. They all provide stats in the same places. It's just into the degree in which they get them, and the total amount in which they get them, and the degree at which they progress across levels that they get them. So all of them are adding hit and evade to the final calculations of combat. They some of them provide positive. Most of them provide positives. I believe artificial new type provides a negative. Artificial new type is the one I'm least confident in. It's a little bit weird how the last calculations go, so I'm not fully sold on that one. But also at their like highest levels, they are also providing extra accuracy, or sorry, not extra accuracy, extra range to weapons that require their stats. It's also one of the reasons why you'll see there are new type weapons on, or there are new type requirements for weapons with Gundam units, and they're like listed as like new type level 1. Like, well, if everyone has it, why is this isn't a requirement? Why is this here? It's just so that we can also signpost that this weapon is going to get buffed by having higher levels of a new type. I guess that's worth saying too. If a pilot has any of these 4 stats, they qualify for the requirements of using a weapon. So like if it says new type level 1 and they have enhanced human, that still counts. If it says new type X and they have artificial new type, that does still count. But any pilot that has these skills are going to rate pretty highly. They are really, really effective. They are basically even at about mid-range, they are close to a focus. Maybe they're not equally exactly a focus, but they are like roughly close to a focus because you don't have to spend any SP on them, and they are always active at all times. And then when they get to their highest levels, they are jumping well beyond the realm of spending SP on it. And they're also applying at the part of the equation where you want them to apply the most, which is to say the end. They're just like lopping off full values of those stats rather than having to like factor in and then like they don't have to be run through the equation and thus be degraded through enemy resistances. Or yeah. So I rate characters with those effects really highly, and then those who get it early really highly. Like you'll see this with the Universal Century Gundam pilots too, that the characters who start with and gain more rapidly levels of new type are also going to be higher on the list. That's like that's why Amuro is so high up, and that's the same reason why I have like quote Jamil as high as he can go. The skill is indispensable, but I didn't know how to stat it correctly. I think it's like probably messed up in my spreadsheet if you're looking at that. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about that much, but if you have a pilot that has new type, they are worth using. In all 4 of those forms, whatever one of those forms are, they are worth using. They are contributing a great deal to your game. The Gundam X pilots, it matters a little bit less because A, there are fewer of them, so we can't take it into account as much. So the ones that do have it, it factors in more, but they show up way later into the game. And B, you already have that accuracy accounted for in a couple of different other ways. Like almost the best version is to put it on a unit that has high mobility and a lot of extra hit for their weapons, and then not worry about it on your pilot at all, and just let your pilot have like damage-based or like other utility-based spirits to sort of like save a room there. So the fact that Tifa provides that for Jared is really good, but I need to separate them out because you're also not going to have Jared you're not gonna have Jared plus Tifa for the whole game. Like there's a portion of the time where you're going to be able to pilot the Airmaster Burst where it's just going to be Jared, and he would be rated much less. He'd be rated much lower down if we didn't have access to Tifa at some point. So it's like still probably worth training him to get access to Tifa. Speaking of worth training, Jamil, despite the fact that he has new type X, has to be somewhat low down on this list. I mean, he's like right in the middle because there's some problems with the other pilots. But he has to be somewhat low down on the list because he is also locked to a battleship for the first portion of the game. And the Ferdan is not my favorite battleship. It definitely... I think in this game, all of your new type pilots, again, using all 4 of those skills in the same way, a lot of them are fighting against their units. I think they are better than their unit is. And if we didn't make units with lower stats to compensate for the fact that we're going to have characters with high stats, if we gave those units the same, like roughly the same level of stats as someone that as a series that wasn't going to have new type in it, they would be far and away some of the best characters. But the Fredan is just such a poor, it's just so inefficient as a battleship that odds are you're not, despite the fact that you have Jamil for an early portion of the game, you're probably not going to be training him that much. If you can like sneak a kill here and there, also to get access to a secret, and we'll talk about that in a second, then that's probably how he's going to end up getting played. But it's really hard to like make him a primary carry for the early portions of the game. But once you actually get him, there's a point where you're going to switch over to using a Universal Century battleship, and then he's allowed to pilot Gundams, or I mean mechs. He can pilot any of the Universal or the Turn-X, the after-war, no, not Turn-X, that's the wrong thing. After-war Gundam X, he can pilot any of the mechs from that then. He can never go back into Fredan though, so I guess not any of them. But at that point, he's like probably worth using. He has New Type X. He is one of the best users of New Type X, and he also gets it the most rapidly. So speaking of that, we are going to jump over 2 tiers for a second, because it's hard not to talk about these two together, which is to say Lancerow. He is the secret that comes through Jamil. Jamil has to do, there's a number of steps to get access to Lancerow. Jamil needs to get 20 kills. We also need to go to combat with Lancerow and talk to him a number of different arbitrary ways throughout the course of, I think, 3 different scenarios. So I would say he is probably the second most rigorous pilot to get. I think Puru 2 has to be the most, because there's also another character you're going to get before her. And then I guess Master Asia is third if we want a little tier list in this tier list. But because there are a lot of hoops to jump through to get access to Lancerow, I can't have him that much higher, because like you have to be on a specific path to get access to him. And again, the same way I said about, I guess we haven't talked about this yet. Well, I'm going to say this about the Purus. If you need to go to combat with them to be able to enact their joining requirements, and they are very not defensive, if you have been training these characters, it's very easy to accidentally like do too much damage and kill them. So you don't want that. I mean, like you can plan around it fine, but there are still stipulations, so like they can't be ranked that highly. But otherwise, Jamil and Lancerow are practically the same pilot. They have, roughly speaking, almost exactly the same stats and get things at exactly the same times. So Lancerow has to be a little bit lower just because there are stipulations. And then Karis and Anil are also kind of a paired set. You get them at the same chapter. You get them, quote unquote, at the same chapter. You get Karis at the beginning of that chapter, so she can be used throughout the whole of it, and then you get Anil at the end of that chapter. You do have to fight her in it, but you'll get them at roughly around the same time. And Karis is almost strictly speaking just better than Anil. Karis does have the artificial new type, where Anil just doesn't have anything like that. I do like the unit that Anil comes in better, but you can switch them around. But yeah, otherwise they are sort of just role filler pilots. They are, if you have After-War Gundam X pilots that you want, or units that you want to use, you put these two in it once you've run out of other characters to use, in my impression. I think they would probably rate a little bit higher for me if you got them earlier in the campaign, though. They're still like, they're not bad, but right, this is all still relative to pilots that are designed to be very accurate, and I do also rate accuracy really highly. You're not wasting actions that way, but because you get them later into the game, it's again hard to give them a lot of credit because they're not going to be around for a large amount of time. And then Pala is all the way at the bottom, largely because she is similar to Fa. We'll talk about, or I guess she's similar to Ru and Fa sort of at the same time, which is to say she doesn't have a lot of stats, and she doesn't really feel like she's designed around going into combat, which makes sense because she is the primary pilot for the G Falcon, which is the unit that like links up with the Double X, the Airmaster Burst, and the Leopard Destroy. So like if you were using her in the way, quote, that the game designed her, she isn't going to see combat that much, so she doesn't need stats. She mostly needs spirits, but then even her spirits are not that good. I think it's a very interesting design. I just wish it was pushed a little bit more. Most of her spirits are reflexive. You can't spread them out. We don't have things like Bless or like Cheer. We have Excel, we have Valor, we have Spirit. So you're really, really supposed to connect her to another unit. And I'm going to mention this with Fun Psyche too. I dock points from a lot of units. They're going to be dropping places pretty rapidly if they need to have 2 different deployment slots to get access to them. I would much rather a couple of actions that are mediocre than one action that is good, because the difference between mediocre and good in this game is pretty minor. So just having more actions to take is better. And Pala is not going to use those spirits that I mentioned the best. They're really designed for her to give them to the other pilot who's going to be in charge of the combined unit. So like, you're not supposed to keep her, you're not supposed to play with her separately. And if the best version of her requires you to also waste a deployment slot, then like, she cannot be that good. Additionally, you also get her pretty late into the game too. Not as late as Tifa. Tifa is so much higher because what she provides to Jared is so overwhelmingly constructive for what he needs that she is fighting her deployment really successfully, as opposed to the rest of these pilots who are just like, it's fine. And then this same thing is applying to the Shin Getter. The Shin Getter shows up even later still than that. You get the Shin Getter in chapter 26, which is, by my counts, nearly into the late game. It's at the very end of middle late game. Also, you don't get the full extent of its kit until scenario 27, and that also requires you to complete a secret. You have to lower Emperor Gore down to critical HP, but not kill him, and then also have the Shin Getter at critical HP. You might not have to lower Gore. Now that I say that, I think it might just be that the Shin Getter needs to get low and just have Gore on the battlefield. But regardless, the cost is that you don't actually get kill credit for Gore, so you're not getting any of his funds or the part that he drops. And he drops a very good defensive part. If it's not the best defensive part in the game, it's the second best one. And like, those are things you are actively paying to get the Shin Getter's best attacks. Those attacks are good. Like, no, you don't have Stoner Sunshine. You don't have Stoner Sunshine or Final Getter Crash. So like, you do want to get access to those. Those are really good. Stoner Sunshine especially. It's a 1 to 3 3800 power at base, but there's no cost associated with it. So like, it can't get that much credit. But anything that I said about the Neo Getter is true about the Shin Getter. The 3 still goes in the water, which definitely gives you points. Going in the water is definitely a thing that has value to it. But this game a little bit less so, as there's just fewer scenarios that persistently have water, right? Like, you will get it sort of scattered throughout the game, but it's also sort of out of the way, where I think a lot of previous games or later games are going to feature water rather heavily around the center. You can't depend on that with R, so you can't bring into this game this mindset of like, if you can get in the water, you're going to be very safe and you can pretty much clear the scenario. Like, getting in the water is safe, but you're going to largely be away from a lot of the action. You're going to have to try and intentionally move some enemies over there. But it is still credit, because once you were in the water, you're going to practically take no damage. Very few enemies have the ability to effectively do damage in the water. And the Getter 3 is also the most defensive of its 3 forms. The Shin Getter also has access to energy regen, which is definitely really valuable for an energy hog like the Shin Getter. So it's sort of trying to like take care of one of its own problems. That's the part slot you don't have to dedicate to it. So it definitely gets credit for that. I guess actually one of the other big differences is that instead of the Neo Getter, where the Getter 1 is on the ground and the Getter 2 is in the air, for the Shin Getter, the Getter 1 is in the air and the Getter 2 is on the ground. There is burrowing in this game. I don't find it exceedingly useful. I like have to remind myself, like, even in that sense, I had to go look and go, is there burrowing? Can the Getter 2 burrow? And I have the note that says it can, so I guess it can. But I don't find it that useful. Like, technically it's an extra thing it can do, but I've never once found that I've wanted to. Okay, I think that wraps up A tier. We'll go through B. B is going to be a little bit faster, because half of these entries are just redundancies, but they have to be separate because they are just like different qualities. And then we'll cut it off after B. All right, so the Valkyrie, to me, is the queen of B tier. You get the Valkyrie early. It needs investment to be able to perform. It has the lowest HP in the game, so like, if it takes a hit, it's probably going to die. That said, it does have very high mobility. At 120 to start is pretty high. And it's also super small, so it's going to have a higher rate of dodging anyway. It's the only super small unit you're going to get throughout the game. But it doesn't feel fully safe enough on its own. Like, it definitely needs some investment to be able to fully dodge. That said, once it gets going, you can pretty well assume that it's going to be dodging most combat. It also has a support unit that's going to upgrade into later. It by itself right now can't provide any resupplying, but it will turn into a jet later that can resupply. So again, if you're investing into it, that's sort of investing into 2 units, a little bit more so than what we talked about earlier with the Airmaster. Largely because it's a snap-off unit, but we'll talk about snap-off units a little bit more specifically later. Just know that investing into the Valkyrie is also sort of upgrading another unit later. But Vega, the pilot of it, also comes with Blessing from the outset. Like, she has that right out of the box. And I'm always going to give credit to a unit that is going to make getting the rest of my team upgraded faster better than I would a character that could fight combat really well but contribute nothing else to the team, right? If all she could do was Blessing, I don't know how highly I would rate her. I mean, that said, she's right next to a couple of just SP bots, but while I like Blessing, I don't think it itself is good enough on its own. It's not making that map more efficient. It is the promise that a future map is going to be more efficient because you're getting more money to make better investments. But after a point, that stops being as valuable, which is also why she's in B tier and not in A. Because you will have scaled to the point where all of the units that have all of the funds that they need already have them, so you don't need to keep reinvesting into them. She does have a pretty dramatic downside in her combat in the air is rather atrocious. She has exactly one of her 4 attacks, just missile, that has 6 ammo for the air, and that's it. Outside of that, she can't do anything. She does have 4 parts, and another character that I will give the highest credit to, which is also why I couldn't be on this tier list, has 4 parts, and I typically describe it as having 3 and one of them being dedicated to something to get it off the ground. I think it's probably reasonable to describe Vega that way too. If you think of her as a unit that has 3 part slots, which is still 1 more than most can say, and her 4th part slot is giving her something that lets her fly, she is a vastly better unit. It's also a resource that she would be consuming. There's a couple of different parts that can do it, that no other pilot really wants. Pretty well all of the stat and terrain changes are practically useless in this game. In 2 entries, we're going to talk about the other units that could technically use them for some purpose, but it's like, it's more because you're forcing a reason to use them than anything else. Pretty much every unit has the terrain type that they want to have. And if they don't, they probably have a transform button somewhere in their arsenal. So just like use that and turn into the air mode instead. But Vega is like maybe one of the 2 or 3 pilots that is like, okay, no, you could jump them and that would actually do something. She naturally has hover, so she can go over like water, but you need to get her into the air to give her a stats for her combat in the air. Okay, next, talking about SP bots, I really like the Taurus and Noin. I really like the Taurus-Noin combination, mostly because of Noin. If I could just have her stand as a person in a square and just like stand in the corner, stay out of combat, I would still probably use her for the beginning of the game. It doesn't hurt that the Taurus can maybe clean up a couple of kills. Like, it definitely can perform in combat. Like, 2,000 power is not nothing to sneeze at. But I'm not going to be sending it off on its sort of own missions. But the real asset that Noin brings is the Spirit Dedication. It costs 30 SP, and it can give any other unit 10 SP. And I emphasize that very specifically because A, if you're new to Super Robot Wars and you've been playing Y, or you have seen me complain about this with Y, this is irrespective to how many pilots there are, where Y only gives it to main pilots. In R, when you give someone dedication, every pilot gets that. So like, if you're giving it to the Neo Getter, and you will have the Neo Getter one scenario after you get the Taurus, that's actually 30 SP. You're just taking 30 SP off of one pilot and giving it, putting it somewhere else. If you spend a dedication on the Combattler or the Voltace, you are actually adding SP to your SP pool overall across your team. It's not combined, so it's not like a direct one-to-one, but you are adding plus 20 SP every time you spend a dedication on the Combattler and the Voltes. So the fact that Noin can do that from the start, she has that immediately. She also has Trust, which can heal the rest of your team, so like you are allowed to play a little bit more risky. She can kind of do basically the two things that you want a support unit to do, short of just like adding spirits to the game that we just don't have, which is to say, I always want a game to have Tailwind. That's giving another pilot excel. So right, like she herself is not contributing to your, she herself is not adding to the efficiency, but she's letting every other unit perform more efficiently. To that point, she also gets advanced very, very early compared to most pilots. She gets at a level 25. So if you do want to invest into her some by getting her kills, and it's not a task to get there, you can get a pretty early advance. I will say there is definitely also an option where you just intentionally take route splits that don't include her. Whenever you go into a route split, all the units you don't use are going to get 2 levels per route split they are in, as opposed, except for the last one, that gives you 3. To try to make up for the fact that they haven't been on the team. And like, if you're going into a route split, you might be forced to lose some pilots you were using part of your team, right? Like, it's not going to take just whoever you want. They're already pre-selected, and that might break up the composition of what units you were using. So you could let Noin go into those route splits to try and like farm her up a couple of levels to get her closer to a really early advance. And that's sort of like all she could do, but an S, like in a lot of, I'm comparing this to something like a staff bot in Fire Emblem. Saying that's all she could do, I think, is a little belittling to how good of an effect that she has. If you watch my R playthrough, you will see that I use her pretty regularly early on, but she is also the kind of character where it is also okay to just use her until she stops mattering. Like, if you get up to a point where you're filling your entire roster with all combat units, you're like, I don't really have space for her anymore, then like, that's fine, just don't use her. She already served a really good purpose by getting you into that like middle game way more effectively than probably a lot of the other pilots you could have used were. And she is also just replaced with better SP bots later. As good as Advance is, and it is very good, you are going to need dedication a little bit less later into the game when A, more pilots get it, and B, you just leveled up enough that your SP pools are bigger. So like, if you know what you're doing, you might not even need to get through your entire SP pool before the scenario ends because you can clear it so quickly. So like, what's the use of getting more SP? Then you're pretty much only just there for Advance, if you even got to that. And like I said, that would require some investment. So like, those are resources you are spending that could go elsewhere, you see? But yeah, use Noin for as long as she is relevant. Once she starts falling off, as soon as you find you're like, I probably don't need this anymore, I've got someone else who can cast the same spirits she can, I need more combat units, then like, bench her, and that's totally fine. Like, she served her purpose. That's exactly what B tier is for. Next we have if you're looking at these next units, these next Ice Devalises, and you're going, those look wrong, that's correct. I have cobbled together, in fact, 2 different pictures to make them. That's because the Ice Devalises actually have 3 different forms. They have the flight frame, the OG frame, and the artillery frame. This is a combination of the flight frame and the OG frame because they are, in fact, the same. There's like a very slight difference in how some of their combat works, but so small that it does not matter. The only difference is the flight frame gives you an A in air, and the OG frame gives you an A in space. And so, yeah, you always have a B on the ground, and you always have a C in the water. But switching back and forth between these two changes which one is A and which one is C. You also can't change these in the middle of combat. You have to do it before you get into combat, so you need to know the stage ahead of time. But all of these units you get very early on. You get access to them again as soon as you leave the tutorial, and they are decent. They are dependent on having their battleship, which I would normally call a downside if you are dependent on having another unit around for you to be able to be better. But because it's the battleship, and if you're already wanting to upgrade, if you already want to use the Nadeshiko pilots, you're probably going to be picking the Nadeshiko stages. Like, why would you not pick the Nadeshiko route if you want to use the Nadeshiko pilots? Then you already just have the Nadeshiko, so it's not actually like consuming a slot you need to spend, right? Like, I can't penalize them for using things that are along with, like, you're already using those resources anyway. They're not going to get penalized for using something that's already present, you know? I want to try and draw the difference because I already like made a big fuss about like spending resources, and I'm going to penalize units very heavily later for being dependent on other units to be good. So I just want to try and like make it clear now that there is a distinction being drawn and why I am drawing it. I do have these in roughly the order that I would like them in, though I would not be surprised if through some more playing, and like I've played this game 15 times, I've not played it 150, and that does make a difference. I do think I know a lot of what's going on, but I have, I would say, pretty biasingly used most of these units, if at all, once. I've used everyone, but I've only used them once, barring a couple. Like, stuff up here in A&S, they got some play pretty much throughout most of the scenarios, but a lot of the rest of these only got really, like, sort of one use. So maybe there's some, like, smaller details about the Ice Devalses that I'm not picking up, but I do have a logic behind why they are the way that they are. So, first, these Ice Devalses have the misfortune of sort of being statted antithetical to their play pattern. The unique quality to them is the gravitational wave arrangement, is what I'm going to call it. These ones have the antenna, and the battleship has the receiver. If you're within its range, it's like a 4 or 5 tile range. I can't remember off the top of my head because I don't use the Nadeshiko units that much. But it's like somewhere relatively close to the battleship. And you will see it once if you start moving the Nadeshiko battleship. If you keep the Ice Devalses within that range, at the beginning of player phase, they effectively have HP energy max. HP energy. Energy regen max. They will get all of their energy back as long as they are within the Nadeshiko's gravitational receiver range. So that means you actively want to be spending a lot of energy on them. But in early game, you aren't going to have the morale already from getting lots of kills and giving you your ace badges. You aren't going to have like Shuffle Crests, which get you started with 5 extra morale to begin. And you aren't going to have the ability to like cast spirits that are going to boost their morale. And the only time that they get to spend energy is also locked behind a morale cost. It's 110 and 120, so like not that steep. That's just 10 points you have to get and then 20 points you have to get. But again, if you're playing efficiently, getting 20 points across 5 pilots, you need to get 100 morale. Like that's probably not going to happen. You're probably not going to see the vast majority of these pilots reach their best attack. And that's for what? Like the main gist of your squad? Like they can't be an A if that's the case. And that also means that these two, so Guy and Akito, who prioritize melee, and all of those units have... Actually, sorry, I guess I forgot to say this. All 5 of these units, while looking different, perform basically the same as each other too, not just internal to the OG versus flight frame, but Akito and Guy are the same and are slightly different than Hikaru, Ryoko, and Izumi. But roughly speaking, they are all basically the same unit. And while the unit prioritizes melee, its best weapons are melee, and Guy and Akito do have melee, you're just probably not going to see that melee that often early on. So their stats are being pulled into account less often, where you're going to be stuck using ranged attacks pretty well more regularly. They do have melee options at base, like they don't need morale to access. All of their melee attacks are not locked behind morale, but when they don't have the morale, their best attack is a ranged option. Also, Hikaru, Ryoko, and Izumi bring something to the table that is more than just combat, and they are also proficient in combat. They're not the best combat pilots, but they do a decent job, where Akito and Guy are just combat. I think the thing that was supposed to make Guy unique was counter. I don't rate counter very highly because I can't count on it. And a lot of the protagonists have potential, and potential just does not matter in this game. It does provide a evasion and hit increase, but it's negligible, especially compared to something like new type that is always on, that it doesn't matter. I do have Hikaru first because she starts with Fortune, and while normally I would give a unit credit for having Bless because it give it to any character, the fact that she has to give it to herself kind of also teaches you, like, be aggressive with them. You should push with them. They will survive. They're pretty dodgy. You're not supposed to block with them. You're supposed to try and dodge with them. You're going to probably want to be close to your battleship, so if they do take damage, just pop one back into the battleship for that turn. Like, I could see a very normal play pattern of you have 3 or 4 of these units out at once. One of them is the battleship getting healed, and then you just rotate out which one is taking damage and needs to go back in the battleship. Hikaru also gets Valor decently early on, and that's only going to improve your ability to be able to land these, like, sort of circle strafe tactics of, like, she gets a Valor, hits something, takes damage back from the boss, next turn goes back into the battleship, like, rotate through, you know. Her and Izumi also get their support attacks pretty early on, and again, you're going to already want to be clustered closer to the battleship, so odds are you're going to be adjacent to the rest of your pilots more so than you would be normally, so it's going to be easier to take advantage of those support attacks. I do have Ryoko splitting up the two of them, though, simply because she starts with a point of leadership and can get a second. It's going to take a minute to get the second one. It's at level 33. But just starting with a point of leadership that is mobile is definitely valuable. Like, especially in the early game where the Nadeshiko's leadership is going to be smaller than the range of its antenna. Having Ryoko the Juku position at the edge of the gravitational wave range and still get a leadership bonus is definitely indispensable for this, like, close together team. It is also worth noting that these 3 girls have a combination attack together and the 2 boys have a combination attack together. They can only do it with each other, and they can only do it if they're in one of these sets of units and in the same set. So, like, if Akito is in OG and Guy is in flight, they cannot make the attack. If they're in artillery, they cannot make the attack. They always have to be in the same ones with the same group of 3. It's not that good. It's also morale dependent, and all of them need to have that morale to be able to do it. So, like, but it is definitely there, and it's definitely something you can do. So Rain in the Shining Gundam is a kind of interesting case. This is not the default sort of definition of that unit that would go to the title of Domon being its pilot, but we'll get to him later. The fact that he is not up here with her should tell you what it is that's bringing this unit up to this position, which is to say almost exclusively the pilot. I'm not even going to bother going over the combat statistics here. It can perform combat if necessary, and that's, like, probably something that Rain is going to need to do to be able to keep up with levels, to be able to use her spirits. But it just get kills with her whenever you have the ability to chip. She's going to be mostly in close range combat, and she's not that good at it, so giving her whatever sort of leftover kills are available is definitely the game plan. But no, the reason you want to use Rain is for her spirits. She's one of the best spirit bots in the game, purely on the fact that she has Rouse and Dedication very, very early on. We've talked about Dedication already. That's the one where you can give SP to other pilots, but Rouse is really what makes her good. Rouse adds 10 morale to all 4 of the pilots orthogonally adjacent to the caster. Rain gets us at level 9. You are never going to get her before you get level 9. So she basically has this right out of the box. The soonest that you can get her to level 34, that's when she can cast Rouse twice, the better. In the meantime, she can cast 1 Rouse and then Dedication with the rest of her SP. But adding up to 80 morale to your battlefield with 1 unit is absolutely backbreaking. Not only is that going to be pushing most other pilots to their thresholds of being able to use their special attacks. If any pilot requires a morale threshold in order to be able to activate anything, so like Majin Power, I forgot to mention this with the 2 Mazingers, but Majin Power does have a morale threshold in this game. It's at 120. So she can bump anyone to that. She is part of the G Gundam squad, and all the G Gundam units have golden forms for their super or hyper forms respectively, and those require morale thresholds, so she can bump those people up. Hero for the Zero system, which is definitely the best part of his kit. It is all around very useful. 10 morale is 5% to damage, and if you can do that twice, that's 10% to damage. That's a pretty sizable swing, and she is right next to Funsaiki because of basically that exact same reason. He also has Rouse to start. He does have a couple of other spirits. We'll talk about those. Some of them we will talk about more when he comes up later, but for right now, the things we care about are Rouse, dedication, and resupply. Again, this is working exactly the same way, where Rouse is your primary verb, dedication is your secondary, and then resupply maybe if necessary. But your odds are want to burn the Rouses first to get morale really early on, especially you could have Rain and Funsaiki at a diagonal. Yes, I don't think they should be apart. I think if one is good, both are better, because the more you can press specific advantages in these kind of games, the better. So with them together, you could either distribute their Rouses across two different sets of 4, so 20 SP or 20 morale each. Or you could put them at a right angle and give it to 6 different pilots, 4 of which are receiving 20 from the edges, and 2 of which are going to be receiving 40, basically putting them at max morale to start. This might feel like you're wasting morale if they're going to be gathering some over the course of a scenario, but again, if a scenario is short, and those are your boss killers, you can then throw them forward very rapidly the next couple of turns towards bosses, and you are already basically at max performance. The one downside to this, though, is that your units do not start adjacent to each other, so someone's going to need to move somewhat suboptimally during the first turns. It is decent to just push forward some. All of these pilots have support defenses, so people are going to stay safe. You're probably not going to get heinously clobbered, but if you want to employ this strategy, you're going to need to have to watch out for your HP a little bit more than if you were not, simply because your first turn is going to be not as pushed as your future turns. The reason you do it, though, is you're investing 1 turn early to try and shave off turns on the back end, and inherently the later the scenario goes, the harder it's going to get, because enemies are going to scale up to catch up with you. So you're trying to jump your morale up earlier to outpace their morale growth along with you. And in a couple of scenarios, you can just sort of skip elements. It's not nearly as dramatic as earlier entries in the series, where if you just weren't around for the turn that an event flag triggered, it just didn't happen. Usually, if something was supposed to happen once you clear a map, it will. But you can do it in such a way where enemies don't have the ability to sort of link up with each other and form a larger squad. There may be... I can't fully remember. It's a long game comparatively to try to have to keep track of. There's 70 plus scenarios in the thing. But there might be a couple of things you can end early by skipping some turn deployments. But irrespective to that, you are basically spending a turn ahead of time to gain 2 or 3 turns on the back end. And that's why I like them. They come somewhat later into the game than I would like, but they come early enough that you are going to be able to actually get some use out of them. They're showing up on turn 25, so that's in the middle late game, but about halfway through the middle late game. So you still have over a quarter of the game left, which should say something about how good they are, because they are this high in B. I would say once I have the 2 of them, they are pretty well always staying on the team. If you're going to cut one, you're probably cutting Funsaiki, because its actual combat performance is worse than the Shining Gundams. But one of the reasons you might want to keep it, and one of the elements it's also down lower, is it's not also a full unit. R does not have many in that it has 2 sets of units that you can deploy in pieces and then combine together to make a much better form. And Funsaiki can form one of those with either the God Gundam or the Master Gundam, which is it's just God Gundam plus Funsaiki or Master Gundam plus Funsaiki. It's definitely better on the God Gundam because getting the Master Gundam definitely takes some doing. It requires some amount of specificity in your plays and is definitely like demonstrably a secret. So of course that's going to get marked down in my book. And you also you've had a much longer time to train Domon, and he gets more out of investment, where Master Asia kind of just stays the same. He's already a really high level, so you're not going to like get a lot of levels on him, and he doesn't really learn a lot. Most everything he has comes from the start, so like you don't need to invest into him as much. So I'm more apt to put Funsaiki on Domon, but that does mean like rather than Rain being like, I would say like 75% of a unit, seeing as she's not really that designed to go to combat. She can do it, but it's not gonna look the best. Funsaiki is more like 25% of a unit because he's really mostly just there to eventually tag into one of the God or Master Gundam. And you can separate them and like jump them back and forth between them, but I think that's hurting you more because you've deployed both the Master Gundam and the God Gundam at the same time. So the Funsaiki's got to be definitely a little bit lower on the tier list than Rain. And like, let me make a point, and here's a good example of what I was talking about like feeling bad. I love Funsaiki. I think this silly horse is one of my favorite characters in all of mecha fiction. The fact that we get a horse that gets to like ride around in a unicorn version of itself is excellent. So please understand that just because I'm like not giving Funsaiki the most credit, if it was about like my favorites, he would be at the top of S tier. He's S tier in my heart, but only mechanically I would say a B tier, just because he's not going to show up for the whole of the game, and like it would definitely be a lot better if he could perform actual adequate combat. Speaking of characters that I like, and also maybe a character that is probably far too high, I'm willing to be persuaded, but as it stands right now, I have my reasons. The Sandrock Gundam. Unlike a lot of other Gundam series, the G Gundam pilots and the Gundam Wing pilots can't switch back and forth between their units, despite the fact that a number of pilots get in them in the shows. Rain is a little bit of a unique case. This is more relevant for hers than necessarily Katra's, but she switches, but it's a permanent switch. It's a one-time switch that the story performs. So no worries here trying to identify which pilots should be switching back and forth between each other. This is like probably pretty obvious and maybe doesn't need to go said in the video, but it did jump out to me when I was first thinking about assessing them, and the fact that I couldn't switch them was like baffling to me. I figured there was something I was missing, so I at least wanted to bring it up here. So yeah, the Sandrock Gundam is like the definition of generic, but like parentheses good. It kind of does a lot of everything, but it does so many everythings that I think all of them add together to be enough to just be a like good solid unit. Remember how I talked about S being like, you could probably throw these at anything and they could always perform? That is how I feel about the Sandrock Gundam, but like in lowercase. You can put it anywhere and it'll definitely do something. It'll definitely like keep pressure in that area. It'll definitely hold that point. It'll definitely add spirits to your team if you need them. It can't do it for the whole scenario, but it's like a good stopgap if you are like, oh no, enemies are moving in a position where I don't really want them. Let me send the Sandrock in to sort of like stall 2 or 3 of these guys while I take a squad that I thought I could dedicate towards a different side of the map and pull one of them back over here, right? Like they're deeply out of position. It'll take them 2 turns to get here. Okay, well the Sandrock can hold the position in the meantime. It is one of the most defensive of the Gundam Wing pilots. Not that you should necessarily be comparing just against series, right? Like that's a little bit flawed because, you know, you're allowed to choose all of them if they're all good. But I point out the Wing pilots in particular because they and the G Gundam pilots tend to be the more defensive of the Gundam units. Typically, the Gundam units are more dodge-based. So it is like a slightly more unique element that Catcher can do. Being unique isn't necessarily always good. G Gundam definitely has a defensive-based pilot, and he's nowhere to be seen up here. We'll get to him. Don't you worry. Don't you worry. But I think it's a fair comparison to make, because they tend to be, on the whole, more defensive than the Universal Century or the Gundam X pilots. And the Sandrock Gundam is definitely a tank. Catra has a kind of middling defense, but he makes up for it in all of the rest of his stats. The Sandrock Gundam has 1,200 points of armor, which I would consider a decent armor. Not the best, but, you know, it's actually a decent amount of armor. He has 3 levels of blocking. Like I said before, it's hard to assess the value of blocking, but at least in this case, it's just adding a little bit more. He has up to 3 levels of both support, attack, and defense. Most pilots get up to a level of 2. His third for each is a little bit late. It's in his like mid 40s. But I would say, roughly speaking, you're probably going to be getting to level 60 at the end of this game. I think you could probably do it even sooner than I did. But my last couple playthroughs, I was getting to level 60. So you'll still see those supports for, you know, a portion of the game. He also comes with a point of leadership. And the Sandrock is also just sporting a couple of decent ranged attacks. All of them are post-movement. His best is 1 to 3, which is not ideal, but his second best, which is a difference of, it's 2,500 points and 2,000 points, is 2 to 5. So, like, you can hit most things that you would expect to be able to hit. If he had an Excel instead of self-destruct, I think self-destruct is like basically a dead slot for your spirits, other than like the meme that you can do with Boss and the Great Mazinger. If he had like Excel or he had Wall, I would be absolutely overjoyed. As it stands right now, and he would also probably be at like the top of B, or maybe, I don't think he would be at the bottom of A. He would still be at the top of B, because that's not necessarily like pushing the advantage of killing higher. But I'm not, unfortunately, I don't have a mastery of the stats so well so that I can say exactly why these numbers are like where they need to be, but they are just so that you can largely have him handle anything. I do think definitely one of the things that's helping him is the fact that he has 3 part slots as opposed to a lot of Gundams that have 2. So you are also able to spec into what job you want him to do more with your parts. He holds leftover parts really well, right? Like, he's probably not going to be taking your like new alloy Z's or your whatever the plus 15 mobility part is, right? Like, that's not his job. But if you have like 2 Chobham armor sitting around and one of the like plus the linear seats, I think the +1 range, you could slap those on him and he'll get something done. He will definitely contribute. He does show up somewhat late. You do get to like rent him for a scenario during chapter 20 with the 4 and Jared stuck in the base part. Like, he shows up as a temporary for that one, and like he does some work there, and any kills you get, any XP you get, will carry over to when you get him properly. He shows up permanently once you get to, I think it's 27. It's where the big Gundam scenario is, where you get like just a whole influx of pilots. You get all the double Zeta pilots at the same time, and you get all the wing pilots minus Hero and Wu Fei. Hero is there, but he's a temporary. So he's not that early into the game, but he's around long enough that he is contributing something, and he will always contribute. Next up is the Rigazi, and it is the first unit that both has a snap-off form, and it is the first unit that has all of the Universal Century Gundam pilots. So we got a lot to talk about on this one. Hang tight. Sorry, this might actually end up being a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. Let's talk about the Rigazi by itself first. It is primarily a range-based unit. It's a jet that is somewhat kind of mobile a little bit, not really that much. It's also not that armory. It really has a lot of movement, but its primary sort of like defensive quality is what I keep referring to as a snap-off, which is it has a form change, and it can go between jet and human, but unlike the Taurus, which can switch back and forth, or the Methus that can switch back and forth, the Rigazi can only switch once. It goes from jet mode to human mode and can't go back. In addition, it also, if it would be destroyed in jet mode, it will instead turn into human mode. And when that happens, it'll refill everything, all of its HP, all of its energy, and all of its ammo. So you basically get a brand new unit. This is very effective. This is a very worthwhile quality to have out of a unit. There are only a couple other ones that do it in the game, and they're not being carried by it, but they're definitely getting moved ahead places by having basically what is effectively 2 units in one. The unit itself, though, is not the most spectacular. It only has ranged options. Most of the Gundam pilots are, well, all the Gundam pilots pretty well prioritize range, and many of them do not have that great of melee attacks. So it's not that much of a downside, but for a couple of pilots it will be. We'll get to that in a little bit. Its best attack is not post movement. It's going from 2500 at a 2 to 6 non-post movement to 1 to 4 at 1900. And like that's a 600 point jump. It's not the most, but it's also not a lot. And that you're like losing out on range is a little bit of a bummer. I think I also probably linger in the Rigazi too long. You can probably switch it over into the humanoid form a little quicker to refill those gauges. But you are also dropping some amount of mobility, and because it is a UC Gundam, you're gonna want more mobility. Amuro starts in the Rigazi when you first get it, and I think that's probably why it looks like a better mobility unit than it actually is, because Amuro is just a very good pilot at dodging things. But, like, that is definitely part of the identity that it gets to have, so you can't not give it some credit there. I guess the credit is that it's allowed to host Amuro as a pilot. It does also have 3 part slots, which I just gave the Sandrock credit for, so it's definitely getting credit there. But I think it fails at being able to hold up as a defensive unit long term. Like, once it snaps off, that is basically all of its defensive function kind of out the window. You need to spec into mobility to be able to like stay fully safe or be constantly spending SP on one of your pilots, especially if you don't have Amuro in it right away. You get some good pilots. Unsurprisingly, all the boy main characters are given all of the best treatment, right? Like Amuro, Camille, and Judo are good. They're among the best ones to use. You know, those aren't the only pilots you're going to get. You are going to have other Gundam pilots in the meantime, namely Fa and Four, and to some extent Quattro. He is decent, but he is a little bit slower than Judo at getting resources. And you're also, I have a harder time training him because he shows up for a scenario in a unit that is like that he shows up in the Hyakushiki and it doesn't do anything in this game. So there's like some amount of it feels bad seeing him at first, which is not as relevant for this playlist, or this tier list. But you probably also already have Gundam pilots you are training, so what are you going to switch them into to get to use Quattro? The unit that you actively see is not working is like, it's a tough proposition to argue, and like I don't think he is better. He is not better than the rest of your team at that point. So it's hard not to think of this as sort of the personal unit for Amuro for a bit. But Amuro probably could do better than being in the Rigazi just as soon as we could like find him another Universal Century unit. Right? It's like everything's just not quite lining up. If you look at the bottom of B, you might see some sacrilege I've committed. But this game is not that charitable to the Universal Century, which I don't mind. I love Gundam. Probably, I was gonna say as more as much as the next, but I don't think that's true. I think I love Gundam in an inordinate amount. And it gets done dirty a little bit here. And the Rigazi is definitely a casualty of that. So yeah, let's talk about pilots. If you look on the right side of your screen, I have listed from top to bottom the best to worst Gundam pilots for every Gundam unit. This isn't going to change really at all. The context largely remains the same. Primarily because, as I've said already, but I want to say it deliberately here while we're looking at the units. Basically, every UC Gundam, sorry, not just the Gundam, all of the units are range-based. They don't really use melee. And even still, Judo is the primary melee one. Go figure with a name being like Judo. His range damage is still good, and no unit prioritizes melee. No universal entry robot prioritizes melee over some version of range damage. They might have good ones, but it's never going to be the best. It's going to be great. And again, so like just use your range damage then instead. Very few of these pilots offer spirits that are pushing us into being an SP bot territory. We'll talk about that a little bit more with Fa and the Purus when we get down to the support units. The Purus are good pilots, but they're definitely very low on this tier list because both of them are locked behind secrets, and if one of them gets penalized for being locked behind a secret, Puru 2 has to get penalized, unfortunately, I guess thrice because they're going to multiply, because you have to get Puru to get Puru 2, which means you already need to fulfill a secret. It's not, none of the secret characters are that arduous in this game, but, you know, that means you have to go on that route split, and you do have to make sure that neither of them die, and it's very easy to kill them because they're very fragile. And to get them, you have to go to combat with them too. If you didn't have to go to combat with them, I would put them I would probably put them in front of 4. But in order to actually get them, you have to attack them, and that puts them at a very dangerous risk. 4 comes at a point where you probably largely have your team filled out and you haven't really hit the second wave of like refreshing your team. So it's hard to find a way to slot her in it, and she just has worse performance than all of the rest of the Gundam pilots that are before her. She is definitely like, she is definitely not a primary slot. You're not taking a Gundam unit because of 4. That's like, well, I still have Gundam units I want to use, and they're sort of left over. Let me put her in one too. And then Ru is sort of the only one that's left. I've talked about all these in abstraction, and I'll tell you why in a second, but Ru is easily the worst among them in terms of combat performance. Fa, well, in terms of units that want to go to combat, Fa is missing like 30 stats in everything that involves combat because she's just not supposed to be in it. She is the only unit that I can think of that breaks the like organizational hierarchy of abilities, which is to say, she gets so little potential that some of her other abilities level up more than it, not potential, new type. She gets so little new type that the rest of her abilities one of her abilities levels up more than it, and it's below that, and that's like never something that happens in this game. I don't know why they've denied her higher levels of new type. It's like gameplay story integration, but like how units get new type in this game is very weird to me. Like why only 3? Why did we decide that was the number, and then beyond that is a betrayal to her character, or is just like mechanically too strong? But so other than her though, Ru is just the worst at combat, and you're also getting her at a point where you get her at the same time as the influx of the rest of the new Gundam units. But like, you need to find a place to put her. You already have a gratuity of characters you want to use. You have, at that point, Amuro, Camille, Judo, and potentially, theoretically, Quattro. Even if you don't get Puru 2, you could just have Puru from that same scenario. You have to recruit her from that scenario. And that means you need to have, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 different units that you're going to put someone in. None of the UC Gundam units are good enough on their own to be able to survive pretty well indefinitely in combat. All of them need investment, either in the form of parts or money. Some of them need it in only one of those directions, which is to say the ones that are last left on this tier, the Double Zeta, the New, and the Sazabi. They would use both, but they only need one side of it. But otherwise, you need to invest into both, and like, that's expensive. You could split those resources between a couple of units. If you make one unit really good, but it's drawing the resources away from 3 others, like, I don't think you've improved your team, unfortunately. So it's really hard to find a place to put Ru when you already have a team that's kind of built, and in order to incorporate her, you would need to then find another influx of cash to be able to upgrade her unit. But so yeah, so why we said anything much else about them is because they all practically have roughly the same procedure to get to where they need to do. Pretty much all of them double damage. Pretty much all of them have a way of improving their accuracy. Pretty much all of them have a way of dodging or block, like either flashing or persisting or both damage that they are taking for one interaction. And if all of them can do that and they're just at slightly different levels that they're learning them, I'm gonna pick people based on high levels of stats, or if they're getting spirits at a dramatically different point. Like Quattro is 11 levels behind Judo in new type by the end of it. He just scales so much slower, and while you're getting more levels of new type on Quattro to start out of the box, because you're getting Judo much later into the game, the fact that he requires some levels to gain access to his new type skill doesn't matter, because you're probably going to have him auto level to that point. But yeah, otherwise, pretty well every one of them is good at maybe killing one medium to large size thing. But after you start running into scenarios that have 4 to 5 bosses or feature more prominently super robot enemies, so like the Death Knights, or I guess Death Cane, Hell Knight, the red and blue chess pieces from Zambot, the Great Mazinger duplicates, the Combattler duplicates, and I guess this is a tech. I never know where to put G Gundam. Is G Gundam a real robot or a super robot show? And then all of the Devil Gundams, like the Gundam pilots are definitely doing chip to them. Like you maybe can kill one of them if you spend a Valor, or you spend like the vast majority of your SP. But they start with such low SP totals that it's gonna cost a lot to get that done. And it's not to say that it's not a bad thing necessarily that you're going to be taking taking multiple shots at a boss. That is still something that's going to need to happen, right? Like, you can have 3 of the Universal Century pilots or Gundam X pilots come in, get the boss down to half HP. You're not really triggering potential yet. For what little it's worth, it's still, it still doesn't hurt to think about. And then come and finish up with one really big attack from your giant robots. Like, that's definitely a valid and true option that you can take with them. But notice the hierarchy of that sentence. They're never going to be the stars of the show, unfortunately. So, how can it be anything other than B or below? And unfortunately, a lot of them are below. You might be surprised to see the excellence this low, given how much I've said I've enjoyed it or said how good it is. But I think I really like the excellence on paper, and I think I like the variety that it gives, but it gives that variety in the same way that the Iced Valises do, which is, say, not on the battlefield. You can, you can clearly beat the game with Fiona, and just Fiona, or you could probably do it with Route 2. But I think that can be said for most of the rest of the characters in front of the twins. Are they? Yeah, sure. You know what I mean. In front of the main character. And none of the excellence units really jump out beyond being beyond each other, right? They're definitely the quality that they say they are. I believe the Striker is the land-based melee one. I believe the Flyer is the flying one. But they're not doing that much unique compared to the rest of the cast. They are, however, doing things unique usually when you get them. Or if not unique, it's a very small niche, right? The Excellent Striker has a decently high attack damage, 3,000, for what is relatively a low morale cost compared to, say, against the Iced Valises that have a 120 morale cost. That have a 120 morale cost to start, and you're getting 500 less power. All this is for their best weapons. Not that you always have to use the most expensive weapon, but just it's a very easy direct comparison point. But to that, you are going to end up deploying Fiona a lot. And none of the units that she is in, with barring one exception, are bad. So investing into her is definitely going to make a number of your clears more clean. She also has the excellence also snaps off in the way that the Rigazee does, turning into the agent fighter, but the agent fighter is practically out of combat by the time you're getting there, right? Like, it does so little. It has some of the worst attacks in the game. It has an 800 damage post-movement attack. It's like its best attack, the 1600 damage one, is 1 to 5, but not post-movement. I've seen a couple of places that you could put it back in the battleship to get your excellence back. You cannot do that. If you could, that would definitely move it up a rank or two, but that's not an option you have available to you. You're just sort of stuck. You get to like put it back in between scenarios, but not while you're in the midst of a scenario. It definitely gets some credit though for being able to fill basically any position that it wants. Unlike the Ice Valses, where you are opting between different terrains, you are kind of opting between jobs with the excellence. So it does get to fill a role basically wherever you want on the team, and that's good. It's just that, you know, it's not filling the role in any way that another one of the role fillers couldn't do, but only in its one form. You know, right? Like, you could get a ground-based melee unit, which we're going to see a couple of them in a second, or you could get a really agile, mobile flying unit, which we're also going to see in a second. So, like, it's in front of those because it can do all of them, but because it's allowed to do most things, it can't do any of them really well. I know we're not at the Eternal and the Lightning yet, but part of their placement is contingent on where the rest of these units go, and part of where the rest of these units go is contingent on where they are placed, because they are the ultimate upgrades for the excellence. And again, I could have split this into Ral and Fiona. Unfortunately, I think in a regular playthrough, Ral is probably the better pilot. I like Fiona better, but Ral is probably the better pilot because for some unknowable reason, they can give the Mazingers all of their attacks in the element type that they want. Element type, the melee and ranged elements. But the Excellence Eternal, despite the fact that Fiona is better at ranged and worse at melee, its last attack is just melee. I don't know why they couldn't have just switched it. They could have just said it was different. It's just there's no reason that the Lightning should be better for Ral than the Eternal should be for Fiona. That change definitely detracts from the quality of the units. But they are still good upgrades. They just come very late at scenario 32, and not even like, and then halfway through scenario 32. So, as I've said with some of the other units, if you are already investing into the excellence, and you probably should be simply on the fact that they are the main character, you're going to see them a lot. They're going to get a lot of opportunities to get kills. They can kind of do a lot of things. You already have investment into the excellence, so you're going to want to keep using all the other forms of the excellence as opposed to just taking a unit and putting it on the team that fills that one specific role the excellence was going to do. And then like subbing that unit out for a different unit when you need to switch the context of how they're working. Right? Your money is going further because you get to take all of those roles, which is why it's this high up, like in the middle of B. Next we have the Taugeese. The Taugeese is definitely another unit that suffers under the unit bad, character good kind of problem. Zex is definitely a really respectable pilot. He only has 2 support attacks. You're not going to see them for a while. That's not really what he's in here for. His stats are just like sort of pumped in pretty much every category that matters. He doesn't have the most defense, but like this is still a dodgy unit. You're gonna want to dodge. And he is one of the few pilots that has charge. I did not stat this out as credit to give. I maybe should have, but I think I maybe should have done a lot of different things with that chart. I just needed it to exist, like, again, as part of this proof of concept. By giving charge to a pilot who has a unit that doesn't have good post-movement options that is the kind of design choice I like, that feels like it's incorporating the story without spoiling or saying too much about how Gundam Wing works. But it also doesn't feel like you punished a unit just to be able to give them an ability that makes them look cool, that if you didn't make it an ability, you just gave them back the stats they lost. They would have been basically the same, but without like a flashy little like description for it. It does not feel that way about the Taugeese. There is good reason why a unit with multiple 7 ranged attacks does not have good post-movement options. So the fact that we have a pilot that accounts for that feels like not what you would expect to see out of that unit. Snipe doesn't exist in this game. You can't increase your range by 2, so you have to charge if you want to use a long range post movement attack or a long ranged attack. You can turn it into a post movement one. And 7 range is definitely a safe range. 5 is the average. That's where most enemies are going to be sitting. You can probably get hit by some that have a 6 or 7 ranged attack by surprise because they're sort of designed to do a little bit more than the rest of the generics, right? Like that is their defining quality, is that they get to hit you when you would otherwise think it's safe. But 7 range, and if you give it one of the parts that increases its range to 8, you're pretty well zoning out everything, and you still have post movement options. Like it'll be costly, you're gonna have to spend some charges, but that's a job that few pilots can do. There are a couple other pilots that are going to have very long range based units that I'm going to like absolutely like rag on, and that is because they don't have access to charge rapidly. You need to level them up into it, whereas Zex starts with it, or he gets it at level 11. But again, it's I think it's going to be unlikely you're going to be getting to scenario, I think 27, somewhere in there, with Zex at a point where he's only going to be level 11. It's also a unit that, if you want to put investment into, will use it decently well. I would not say it is wholly stand out from a entirely upgraded unit, but I've never been disappointed when I have maxed out the Taugeese. Most notably in my playthrough in R, where I just accidentally did when I was trying to look at the math and went, oh, okay, no, that's fine, this is working. Right? Like that's the mark of, like, that's like the definition of a B. If you make a lot of like noises with your mouth when you're trying to describe it, that's probably a B tier. It is trying to pretend to be defensive. Like I said before, we were talking about the Sandrock, right? It has like 1,000 armor, which is like approximating defensiveness, but it doesn't have any barriers. You could give it 1, but it has slow part slots. It doesn't have that great of mobility. It has like 7 movement, 7 range. Like it has a decent amount of reach. It's like, it is fascinating to me that you could take the same design concept, where I feel like Zex is, or that the Taugeese is, largely speaking, with an accent of extra range. Also, this like can do a little bit of anything unit, but can't do any of it as well as Catra can. And it's weird to see how that same like description of like design, that's that same design philosophy, if that is in fact the design philosophy that was applied, just turn out very different. Obviously, the Taugeese has way longer range than the Sandrock does, and that's like the most defining quality about it. But just because it's the most defining quality does not mean it's the only quality. The Double Zeta definitely suffers from being a transformable unit, which is not usually what I would say. That's like having extra forms with extra actions is usually a good thing, but they put on very few post-movement attacks onto the base form of the Double Zeta, largely because they want you to be able to fly around in the G Fortress, which admittedly does not even have that good of post-movement options either. It definitely feels a lot more like fly to one spot, do a little bit of something. Okay, you're prepared now for the next turn. Now do a big something on that turn. It definitely feels like one of the ones that suffered the most from not having hit and run in this game. It does also feel like it doesn't know its own identity. It has two very expensive attacks. One that is just regular and one that's a map attack. It costs 100 energy. It starts with 180 energy. If you're turning this into a jet to fly it around, that's 3 energy per space moving because you're off the ground. You have a map attack that costs you 100, and there are a couple ways of decreasing it, but again, you got 2 part slots. That's a part slot that is being dedicated to not be able to make you clear better. And are you actually buying yourself an additional attack with it at the rate of 100? If you decrease it by 10 or 20%, well, no, that's dropping it from 80. That 20 is not. You need to do that 4 more times before that actually qualifies as getting an extra action in. It also has a shield. It has beam coating, but that barrier also requires energy to trigger. So like you're draining energy a second time. And like, I know you can upgrade its energy, but it's not upgrading by that much. Like you're only getting up to 360, only 360, but that's just 3 attacks with the map attack. Like that's not great. You don't have to use the map attack, but the quality of weapons drops off pretty precipitously from there. There is a there are two 2400 power attacks, and then after that we go to 19, 16, and 12. And the vast majority of those, all the post-movement ones are, or not all of them, 3 of those post-movement are 2 or 3 range. One of them is 3 to 5. So it's like not quite there in all of the directions. I think some people, it feels a little bit like a couple different people designed this character, and they all didn't get the memo on what the other one was doing, and were like committing resources that we thought we had to spend in multiple places. It's definitely getting some extra credit, though, from the fact that it's going to get a second form. You can see it peeking over the top of C in the full armor double Zeta. If you put points into the double Zeta, you'll get points into the full armor, because it is just the same thing. And the full armor is the unsnapped off version of the Zeta. I would have put the snap off versions of some of the other units on here if you were able to deploy those on their own, but like you have to deploy the Rigazine BWS first before you can get the mobile suit mode. You could deploy, you are going to deploy the Zeta if you're going to use it for a time without having full armor on. Like you will eventually get full armor by going through the story, right? So like it's worthwhile talking about it on its own. It is also one of the 2 that has like the better quote melee parameters, the other one being the Zeta Gundam, which has the best. Which tracks with the fact that Judo, its main pilot, does have good melee, but it's not enough to warrant trying to like play it as if it is melee. Like you should still just try to shoot things from range with it. It doesn't add anything. Which is, I think, sort of the death sentence for most of these Gundams. Either there's a lot of extra like fluff to try and pad out a unit that looks like it has more going on to it, and it in fact doesn't. Or it's reduced those options so much that it's like such an apparently binary choice that you're like, well, I mean, do I need another long-ranged attacker? The answer is also probably no for the one that has a bloated amount of attacks to it, but it's just harder to see that through all of the extra stuff. It's like much easier to make that call when it's been reduced down to 2 very simple actions. And I don't think the Zeta Gundam escapes from that fate, unfortunately. If it is typical that I don't end up playing it, I usually already have a decently well-established team, and other than the map attack, it's not really contributing anything. It can't defend really well, or if it can, it's not counterattacking, so like why bother? You'd much rather a counterattacker. And none of the spirits are like helping it that much, and if you already have a unit that has good spirits, a lot of the Gundam pilots get them late. Not all of them, but it's a decent amount. They probably have already been in a unit that they want to be using, and the double Zeta is not that much different from anything else. It is a slightly souped up version of... There are many approximations to being close to the double Zeta that most of the Gundam units do, but they only do it in a couple of categories, right? Like, it compares itself against a good number of them, right? So it's better... It's a hero unit. It's better than a lot of the generics, but it doesn't really stand out. Let's talk about the Gundam Rose, the Gundam Dragon, and the Gundam Maxter all in sort of one collective set. So we're gonna try and knock out like 6-ish units all at the same time. They do different things. We'll talk about their differences are, but of the 5 Shuffle Alliance, I think they are the best by default. As you can tell, because we haven't talked about Domon or Argo yet. I did want to make the super modes a separate unit because they just have different stats. They've improved stats when you get the super mode. And I also want to mark it this way because if you feel like you have a consistent way of getting them to super mode, they're definitely worth using. If you don't feel like you have a consistent way to getting them to super mode, maybe you take that gamble and you start trying to think about how you can get them there. And if you can't get them into super mode, they're not worth it. Super mode adds 1 extra movement for all of them. Super mode adds 5 extra mobility, 50 extra armor, and most importantly, 1 extra move. It does add a couple of extra attacks too, but they were already decently damaging enough. You're adding maybe like 500 to 800 points of damage onto an attack, and like you will happily take that. You will use those, but one of the other troubles is that they get costly very quickly. Like we're looking at like 50, 60, 70 energy cost attacks, and we're also sitting at a 180 energy. So like, you're not going to be using them that regularly. I debated whether or not the Gundam Rose and the Dragon Gundam were going to switch positions. The Gundam Rose does have a map attack, and it's also a pretty good one. You get to see a range and then drop a small AoE in that range somewhere, so it's very controlled and very applicable to situations, right? Like, you don't have to put George as out of position to like be in the center of a map attack as you would otherwise. But he also comes with Blessing, whereas Saisaichi has one more move on top of what everyone else has to start. So we're going from 5 to 6 for the Shuffle Alliance normally, whereas Saisaichi is going from 6 to 7. And he's got some good post-movement range too. Like, he's definitely supposed to be the, like, send him out, go pick off the kill. Okay, send him to the other side of the map, go pick off the kill. Okay, go send him back and I'll pick off the kill here until he can either get to super mode for that scenario and like get his stats up a little bit more, or until he starts getting some ace bonuses and then can more easily start. And then the Gundam Maxter is just more melee focused, but all of its spirits are generic. They're the ones you want. That he's got stuff like Bullseye and Persist, but he's just good at combat. That's all he is. And he also guzzles energy so rapidly. You get all of them at the same time, so this is not like this is not placement due to when you acquire them. And you get them on scenario 8, so you get them pretty early on. You have time to train them. So yeah, I guess my point in saying that is, I would, if you had a good case for the Dragon Gundam being over the Rose Gundam, or the Maxter being in between the two of the others, I'd be like, okay, yeah, sure, I believe you. Like, I'm not too fussy about their order. I do mean this order. Like, I do think George is better than Saisaichi is better than Chibity, but like, you could give me evidence that these are going to change, and I would be like, yeah, okay, sure, that's fine, I believe you. But they, if they did not have super modes, they're D tier. They're basically not worth it. They don't do enough damage. They don't have enough parameters in the right places. They don't get there fast enough. All of these characters from G Gundam are trying really hard to maintain the identity that it is a real robot show trying to do a take on a super robot idea. And what that ultimately translates to us for stats is they committed to none of them, so all of them are bad. And that's just like not what you want out of a unit. You can keep them out of combat. Like, I also put George higher because he has the longest range out of all of them. It just in terms of thinking about attack ranges. Saisaichi does have Accelerate, and his unit does have one more movement, so like, he could theoretically make up that range in a different way, but that means you are putting him potentially out of position into the middle of enemy ranges, or like really far away from enemy ranges, but is still able to pick off that last one sort of straggler unit that's broken free. That's definitely a task you want someone to do. He doesn't have to. Like, the Airmaster can kind of do a lot of the same roles that the Dragon Gundam and the Maxter Gundam can, in that it's like agile, it can get to different places, it can clean it can pick off kills, and then it can start contributing to the boss without themselves being the major reason why the boss is dying. The Altron Gundam and the Noble Gundam aren't necessarily paired together in terms of when you get access to them, or, you know, being from the same series, so they're going to be taking up room that the other one isn't, something like that. It's just that they kind of both fill, again, this sort of very like, well, they have 5 range post movement and they have some spirits that you want, but like, there's not much of a standout defining quality to them. Like, there's no Berserk mode for the Noble Gundam. Not that Wu-Fei really had anything to go on, but like, they'll get the job done. You could definitely do worse. Like, I would value them a lot higher if they had some more mobility, because they are on the more mobile side of things. They have some ranged options. Like I said, they can get to 5 ranged attack, but otherwise they are kind of the definition of a space filler, a role filler, a space filler, a role filler. You are not going to want to count on them for getting any jobs done. The Altron especially looks the most like other units of its series, in the form of it's like basically just a copy of the Sandrock Gundam, which is fine. Like, if you have a unit that's already good, having another copy of it is still good. Like, you don't have to play with unique units, but it's not exactly as pushed as the Sandrock is, so it's only an approximate copy. To date this video hardly, and probably to date myself because it's probably not a fresh meme anymore, but it's the like Sandrock Gundam we have at home, which was already the blank unit we had at home. So like, it can't get too much more credit. You also get it. You also get it later into the game. So to that point, the Noble Gundam might be a little bit too low. It may be supposed to be in front of the Ultron Gundam then, but yeah, they're fine where they are. There's not a whole lot to say about them. They're just like, yep, they're there. Okay, so this is also kind of a wonky order because we're doing this from highest to lowest, but we're going to talk about specifically the hyper mode for the God Gundam plus Foon Psyche and not any of the rest of it. This will be the conversation that handles sort of all of this, but it does feel weird that they are in separate tiers, but it is also still probably correct. Domon is a pretty garbage pilot here. He does have really high melee, which you would expect out of him given his whole, like, thing to do with fighting, right? Like, he's a martial artist, so you should expect high melee, and his unit does do a lot of melee damage, so, like, that's good, but otherwise, none of the rest of his parameters stand out. He does have Spirit to try and push him into super mode, or to hyper mode, but that is somewhat costly compared to his, like, 60 SP, and then you're like using the SP that you would otherwise need to be able to survive the rest of combat. So the reason that I have these separate is largely because of the movement and not much else. The God Gundam is already kind of playing from behind. It has one part slot, so that when you have it with Foon Psyche, both of them are combining both their part slots together to give the combined form 2. But that's not good. This is also the same reason why Foon Psyche was lower, in that you need to deploy 2 units to open with it. You will never reach a point where they're going to start combined, so it does take 2 deployment slots to get access to this one unit, and one unit that can do some stuff is definitely way worse than using both of those deployment slots on 2 different units that could get some jobs done. The God Shadow on the hyper mode is definitely something I was kind of sleeping on. It's another one of those like auto dodge chance abilities, and you know, I never loved them. A 30%, a 50% chance to dodge is not something that you can count on. I think I've described this when we've been playing Y. It is more a reactive ability in that, oh, cool, well that triggered, so I guess I have more HP than I thought I was going to at the end of that phase. Well, now I'm going to play differently based on this next attack I'm receiving, or based on this next enemy phase. Or sorry, this next player phase, I mean. Rather than, okay, well, I know I have God's Shadow, so I'm going to send Domon in, and he's only going to take half of those attacks. Like, the randomization of it does not necessarily work out in your favor. Like, you can't count on it. It's definitely a boon, but because the God Gundam is trying to behave more like a super robot, it's kind of trying to stat itself more like it is defensive, but when it's hitting that hyper mode threshold at 120 morale, it's getting the defensive properties that the Sandrock had. Like, it's just getting up to 120 or 1200 armor. Domon admittedly gets stats in the way that Hero does from the Zero system. Like, all super mode pilots are getting 10 points to their non-SP stats. But, like, I have already said that a 5 to 10 stat difference is, like, not that important, but you would care about it if you got it. Like, it's definitely better. I definitely want that. The super mode would be almost unplayable if it didn't have that. But that only works if the unit is already good, and I don't know that it is. 7 movement is a reasonable amount of movement. 8 is what the upgraded version is. 8 is what the hyper mode has, and, like, now we're claiming into some serious territory for movement. That actually, like, that's reliably large enough you can get something done with it. Foon Psyche does have Excel, so you could bump that up to 11. But you're then not spending the rouses from Foon Psyche that you necessarily wanted to, and you're moving it out of position to be able to give those rouses to other people. So, on one hand, I'm okay that Foon Psyche gets to maybe, like, just play 2 fully, strictly different roles, that if it's by himself, he's going to be more of an SP bot for the rest of the team. If he's together with Domon, he's going to be more of an SP bot for Domon. But I already liked the role he was playing, and we didn't have a lot of other units that could play the, like, pumping up the rest of the team So I don't know how much I want to trade off on that. And then to use a character that, you know, he does have 11 move, but all of his best actions are post movement 1, because of course they are. And one of the actions that he has for one of the ranged post movement options he has is 1 to 3, 1200 damage. Like, you're not going to use that. And even still, you are being asked to commit resources into it. Like, the God Gundam definitely wants some investment, and you then have to invest into a character there that could have received funds, or you could have spent those funds on a character that you got earlier into the game and have already gotten investment out of. Like, if the Shining Gundam was good and the God Gundam was okay, I would rate the God Gundam a lot higher, because you kind of already want to invest in the Shining Gundam, the same way we talked about the Airmaster. But you already don't want to invest into the Shining Gundam, and then you can, like, maybe pull together a mediocre unit out of that. It's just not there. Domon feels way too safe. They could have made him do bonkers damage just to single targets, and even then I would have just been saying he was okay. Like, the Voltes and the Combatalor can do that, and they got credit for that, but they can do everything else too, where Domon is not really able to. Where you could look at it and go, well, there's the SP bot on him, and like I just said, but because you need to use that SP to patch up some of his weaknesses, you can't give credit the same. He can't have the same amount of credit as a unit that just has a free extra pilot that's providing SP places, you know? I also think that some of my bias might be showing through here, but I've never found I've actually wanted to use these units. I think it is a really major downside if you're trying to play this game efficiently to lose extra abilities to take actions. Even if you're taking a mediocre action with a unit, that's better to me than it having been just fully removed from the map and attached to somebody else. Typically, these stages are going to be won because you got to do a lot of things, not because you got to do a couple of things decently well. After making Ruining Super Robot Wars R, I'm definitely higher on the Gunner than I was before. I originally had it placed around the Eternal and the Lightning, but I accept it's in B tier now. You do get it really early on in terms of pacing for the game, so you have a long time to use it. You're already probably committed to the excellence anyway, like all those usual things about upgrades. The problem is similar to how the Valkyrie works, which is it has a very difficult time of being able to pivot between whether it's attacking on land or in the air. It starts largely having no access to aerial combat, and then once it gets to 120 morale, it has a decently good attack in the air. But before that, we are largely ammo based, and I think it's also the only instance of a weapon that takes both ammo and energy at the same time for the sextuple Gatling beam gun. So you only get 10 shots of that, and anything below that, you're like, none of these attacks are like that good. So as I described in that playlist, as I described in that playthrough, I'm really having trouble with the words list and play and tier. Any words that use those as part of their compound word is just not coming out well. Sorry. If you watched that playthrough, you will hear me have said, I think the Gunner is decent if we are opening with some amount of flying units for it to be able to pick off, and then, if we have some amount of non-flying units for it to be able to pick off and start getting its morale up there. It doesn't even need to get to 120 just on non-flying units. Like, it can do some attacks in the air. It just can't only be responsible for that job. Right, so if we have to, like, throw that caveat on it, obviously it can't be an A. It's also not being used in a vacuum, right? If it was just this was the main character unit, use it or nothing, you definitely use it. But you are losing out on being able to use the the Striker, if you are switching to the Gunner, right? And if I already have the Striker up at the, like, middle top of B, you are losing that unit to commit to something else that is not as usable. So like that's more of a downside, right? You can compare the excellence units directly because you have to switch their forms out. Whereas if this unit was by itself, like I said, I would probably be a little bit higher on it. But there's not much to say. There's unfortunately not much to say about a lot of these like more long-range based units. So I guess I will say this here globally for all of them, and then apply this for the future to the rest of the units to whom this makes sense. And I'll try to point out specifically when it applies to them. Like, we're about to see it somewhat with the new Gundam and the Sasabi, but mostly those units you're going to find down in D, as far as I'm concerned. If you need to move into a position, plan, but hope that enemies are going to move within your range such that you can hit them with a long-ranged attack, but be out of range that they don't counter you for the next turn, and then repeat that cycle. That is, every time you're taking a relevant action, you have to spend actually 2 turns to get access to that relevant action. This game suffers tremendously from not having a hit and away. A lot of these long-ranged units really deeply need one to be able to reposition themselves for future turns, and because we lack those, you're just extending the duration of your playtime. As much as I just said, switching into the Gunner is paying the price of the rest of the forms. If you have switched into the Gunner, you are still getting something that is contributing to other better forms. Like Fiona or Ral are still getting that experience, are still getting those kills there for their ace bonus. And that money is not being exclusively spent on a long-ranged unit. So that's why that's why I can defend it being a little bit higher than the rest of the long-ranged options. But I'm never going to pick a unit that has really poor post-movement, especially in these series where, you know, enemies are going to keep charging at you. There's definitely some delay in more so in other games, right? Like they're going to come in waves, but you can't just sit around and wait to trigger reinforcements. You can't just sit and slowly inch your units up to the boss and keep them just out of range. A lot of enemies are going to be moving at you, so you want to be able to feel like you have that level of control of the board too, that you have a lot of movement, a lot of flexibility in where you are going, where these long-range units are very rigid. And regularly you will get into the situation where, you know, the identity of them, the fact that they are long-range and are enough that they are out of the range of other enemies such that you can hit them without taking damage, gets compromised by the fact that that enemy is moving. You are active. The long-range units do not have a lot of defense and not a lot of HP, so the enemies want to try and charge them to take them out because they're a very easy target, and enemies are going to prioritize things they can kill. So, like, you might get 1 or 2 of those attacks in before someone else... You might get 1 or 2 of those attacks in before it starts moving, unless someone else blocks it off, in which case the characters that are blocking it off probably should be the ones getting the credit, because that's a thing that they're actively doing rather than a thing that is happening to the board around them. I think broadly my distaste for long-ranged units here is maybe a bit controversial. I think that's probably going to be the one that's going to like ruffle the most feathers, but I do stand by the decision. I have never been happy when I've committed them to any one of my team, like Gunner or otherwise, and have always felt like I probably could have put something else more relevant in that slot. Speaking of more relevant, the Black Serena. I would give the Black Serena a lot more credit if not for 2 factors. A, it comes very late in the game. It's part of the big dump of units at Scenario 32 when you also get the Final Excellence frames. And the best version of it, the high mobility type, which I have placed second on this list, only comes if you've picked the Nadeshiko scenarios and you needed to have selected the Nadeshiko scenario for the start. And I think the Gundam one is probably the better choice. I think in general, the Gundam routes are the better selection. It's easier to be able to clear a kill boss than it is to route a whole map, especially later in the game where you can sort of focus down all of your resources onto a single or a couple of smaller pools of HP. Bigger than a generic, but smaller in comparison to the entire HP pool on the whole map. So odds are you're going to be picking the Gundam scenario, which means you don't have access to the high mobility type Black Serena. So with that out of the way, what does the unit actually do? Well, it's the only unit in the game that has 3 instances of a unit combined into one through snap-off. So the high mobility type snaps into just the Black Serena, which then snaps off into the Ice Tavalis, the Akito custom Ice Tavalis. So it's like one of the few instances of an HP tank that this game has, which is also a little bit at odds with what it wants to do. It is definitely more mobility based than it is defensive based. So I kind of think I see what I'm going for, where, right, like, okay, maybe you don't have to commit spirits to every single dodge chance, right? Like you can take those 25s, you can take those 20s, but like, will you take those 30s? And then if in fact you do take damage despite a decently high mobility stat, you have a really large HP pool, larger than it seems, to be able to absorb some of those hits. It does also come with a boson jump that's a 50% chance to dodge all. That is a 50% chance to dodge all combats once you hit 130 morale. It has an energy restore small to make up for the fact that it also doesn't have a gravitational wave array in these forms. It does have that back when we get to the Akito custom. All of those I don't think are pushing it to be proactive enough, because it doesn't do a lot of damage. If you don't have the high mobility type, you only have one attack with this outer frame. You only have a 1700 power post movement attack, and that's decent. Like that's definitely good. But what I want out of really far moving units that are going to feature like really high powerful main characters is the ability to kill stuff. Like I've said, we've seen a lot of pilots that can clean up kills. That can't be a major credit point for any of these characters, because a lot of characters can do that. The upside is though that its only attack is 1 to 3, which means that it's not as good as its only attack, I guess. That its best attack is 1 to 3. That it can set diagonals for attacking bosses, so it can still contribute something. It's going to get to those bosses long ahead of time of most of the rest of your team, if not the whole rest of your team. So it's not getting to chain support attacks off, right? This unit is very good at activating other people's support attacks. Like you don't really want to be grabbing its 2700 extra damage, as opposed to say like it being able to pull a like breast fire or a super magnetic electric spin. Akito does have a support attack and a support defense, but to reflect the fact that that's maybe not supposed to be his job primarily, he only does get those two. He gets one of each. I do have the Ice Tavalis ranked much lower, because at the very least the Black Serena can be self-sustaining, right? You can fly it off on its own, whereas having removed the energy restore small on it, you are sort of tied back down to the ship. It is better. Getting the energy restoration from the ship is better than an energy restore small, but you can't move as much, even though the customs have higher movement. So like it's a little bit of a conflicting stat. And just also like the custom version is down to one or two of its shells. So like it's going to be less tanky. I do like the idea of it. I would love to see more designs like this. This feels a lot more experimental. Like give the mobility unit high HP and lots of forms. Like if you put that on any other character, like if we put that on a super robot, that would be busted. So it kind of has to be here. It's definitely fun to play, and like I said at the top of the video, I have a tier list that's going to talk more about that in the future. So like, don't fully count the Black Serena out yet. I do think it's a fun unit to use, and you would expect a unit with really high mobility to rank, super highly for me if I care about efficiency. But as we said up with the regular Ice Tavalises, Akito does not really have a lot of spirits he is contributing, and admittedly in that position he was contributing melee when you kind of wanted to be contributing range, and at least they got that part down. The Black Serena does have melee as its primary damage type, so like that's good that your pilot is aligned with the unit. but it's not very, it's flexible in its positioning, but it's not flexible in what it can do when it gets to that position, you know? And flexible on positioning is good, but only if that flexibility actually offers you extra different types of actions you can take, right? Like, well, I can do it anywhere, but well, what is it that you can do? Very specifically, maybe have enemies at any point. Like, okay, sure, buddy. We were going to do half damage to that enemy next turn when they came in on us during enemy phase. You just got to it a turn ahead during player phase. Like, I don't know how much that actually contributes to the team. I mean, I do know. I don't think it contributes a lot in B, but in that little like anecdotal scene I've concocted for you, you know. Which is also why the new Gundam and the Sasabi are where they are. I think the new Gundam is just strictly better than the Sasabi. The Sasabi does have slightly better stats in in many areas than the new Gundam, but the new Gundam has an eye field, so the barrier is really saving it. In that it's doing it is doing a similar approximation as what the Black Serena is doing, which is to say, okay, well, what if you don't have to spend your SP on every single attack you're making to make sure you're dodging these? Like, what if you try to gamble on some of the lower percentages? Here's a way to back up in case you take some damage. And you just don't want to be out a somewhat competent combat unit because it has low HP and you, like, risked a 12% hit, you know? They definitely have more attacks than the Black Serena. They are sort of glued to the spot a little bit more. They suffer, I think, the most from not having hit in a way. The bit attacks on both of them are good. They reach really far. They're 7 range. Technically, the new Gundam can get a combination attack off of the mass production new type Gundam, which is definitely a thing you can use. I don't love it, if you couldn't tell from that intonation. But that is definitely, that's an improvement over the Sasabi, but it's not really changed. Whether or not it had that combination attack, its position on the tier list was not going to change. But outside of all of its like funnel long-ranged options, it has some like 2,000 or weaker powered attacks. And I said that was fine on some other characters, right? If we go back earlier in the video, I said that was fine on some of these, but like, you are getting the new Gundam and the Sasabi at the last junction of the game. That's at scenario 32. Like, 2,000 damage isn't cutting it anymore. And that's its post-movement option. So again, we have this like stall setup, then you get a good attack, stall setup, then you have a good attack. Admittedly, Amuro is a very good pilot, but Amuro, Camille, and Judo are very good pilots, right? Amuro can't just like hop back and forth between the new Gundam and the Sasabi on both turns. Like, there are people that you could fill both roles of those. This is not being penalized by the fact that 2 units are decent, you only have 1 pilot that really wants to operate it. And so they are better than just the long-range units that are in D, but only because A, their pilots are wildly better, and B, because it is a defensible choice because there are also some post-movement options that you can use that the other long-range characters don't have access to. I think they are probably too high. I think they could probably be down in C, like maybe below where the excellence is. Which is enough of a jump to say that like maybe there's a flaw in this tier list. But like I said at the top of the video, I want this to be more of a proof of concept. Like, I need to get something out. I can watch it back and go like, okay, how can I improve this for next time? But I also have a really hard time in video games being able to assess how usable late game options are. I find it very difficult to figure out how to appropriately understand their contributions because we've already made like a lot of commitments to the rest of the squad. So like, what does pivoting look like? What does it mean is it worth it to save resources to upgrade these? If you've watched any of my playthroughs, you can regularly hear me say like, I would much rather spend resources now and make them count towards the scenario that we're going into, rather than save them in the hopes that maybe I can make them count a little bit more if I put them on a different character later. Like, I can probably spend them better, and the way in which I'm spending them can then rebuild themselves over the course of time in a way that if I just wasted them by not investing them earlier, thus slowing down or making less effective my plays, I'm not going to reap as high of rewards. So for these characters that don't have like direct stat, they don't have so for these characters that don't have direct transfers from units you're going to be using over the course of the whole game, I will recognize I have some bias here in not necessarily feeling the most confident in trying to figure out whether it is actually good to sandbag some of your resources to get them upgraded. Like, you're not going to be holding on to them since like 20 onward, right? But like, you know, maybe 30, 31, you know that they're showing up. But I still maintain that I don't think that it is that worth it because of how aggressive the game is and how much it pushes enemies towards you, that you really want to save for characters that need to lock themselves in place. I will say, as far as transfers go, if you put points into the new Gundam during the future scenario, you will see them return to you now in this new Gundam, but like, that's probably kind of nothing. I think I have to say it because otherwise someone will bring it up and be like, well, you can invest and you can get them like later in, you can invest and get something out of it, but like, this is not what I meant, right? Like, you get points in, you only get the new Gundam for scenario 3 and 4, right? So you invest some resources for 2 scenarios and then maybe get it for like 4 scenarios later. That's kind of nothing. And then the Sasabi just doesn't have that at all, so. Okay, that's going to wrap up B for me. I'm going to try and power through C a little bit faster. This is what I was afraid of, that I was going to be talking for so much time, and we are now into the bulk of the units. But we're also getting to the point where a lot more of these characters are like sort of pale imitations of each other, right? We can now describe these as budget version of character we've already talked about. So if you know that, then you can very easily approximate what they're going to be doing. That was way too abstract. So here's a specific example. Both the cupules are basically the same as each other. We will talk about them more specifically when we get to them later, but they are basically carbon copies of each other in all ways that matter. And all of those ways are just less good versions of the new Gundam and the Sasabe. You get them a little bit sooner, but they're lacking. They've chopped out so many other of their features that, you know, they are still just kind of pale imitations of them. Right, and that's like most of the conversation we can have about the cupules. So from here, I'm going to be even a little bit more loosey-goosey in terms of descriptions, just because we're getting into like the kind of characters that are the filler. So like, there's not a whole lot more to say. There's a couple of examples where that's not the case, but yeah, I think we'll start cooking from here. If people want me to like dig deeper into these C or D tiers, like hit me up in the comments. I will happily talk about them. But yeah, we can start moving. We can start moving now.